Liarte Elheim, unlike her twin brother, couldn't manifest her water powers until she was almost 20, but her father found a solution to this problem in some ancient writings. Her brother Leon Riches's incomplete power could be completed by her demise. Her father promised the whole family would never forget her sacrifice. Liarte was the only one who hadn't awakened her powers, a disgrace to the Elheim Duchy. It was no secret to her that no matter how hard she tried, no one in the family would ever truly love her. The Duke ordered the execution to begin, and the mages surrounding Liarte started the procedure. The only thing the heroine wanted at that moment was another chance, so she could just run away from them instead of trying to earn their love. And at that moment, the Spirit Stone suddenly burst into bright light and shattered into a million pieces. The Duke couldn't believe his daughter had actually managed to awaken her water powers. The heroine's eyes snapped open, and she gasped for air like she was suffocating. Liarte looked around, confused as hell, not understanding how she ended up in a room that was burned down before her execution. Maybe this was all just a bad dream, because there was no other way to explain how she was still alive. Suddenly, Leon Ridius walked into the room to check on his sister. Grabbing her hand and glaring at her with pure hate, he said she was a real pain in the neck because she messed up all his plans. The heroine remembered seeing that exact same look and hearing those exact same words 3 years ago. Back then, she'd protected Leon Ridius from hired killers, taking the hit for him. She was wounded and passed out, which meant her brother's plans for that time had to be put on hold. And if it was all happening again now, it could only mean one thing. Liarte had gone back in time. Realizing she actually had a chance to change her fate, the heroine decided to play things differently this time and slapped Leon Ridius's hand away. Liarte wasn't hiding that the feeling was mutual, and she sure as hell wouldn't be that reckless again. Her brother was shocked she'd talk to him like that, but he didn't get a chance to say a word. Ian burst into the room and urgently told Leon Ridius to come look at the Spirit Stone. Turns out, their father had called all the Water Awakeners because the stone had suddenly started glowing. The guy jumped up immediately, telling Ian they could talk more on the way. Right when the execution was about to happen, the Spirit Stone shattered, and the heroine felt like some kind of energy surged into her. Liarte decided to test if she'd managed to awaken the power of water, and she nailed it right away. She didn't know if it was a blessing or a curse, but she was damn sure she was leaving this house this time. Meanwhile, Mikkel Burge was heading to the Elheim Duchy with his assistant. He still couldn't see a thing, and was hoping they could help him lift the curse there. Valto had his doubts, especially since Elheim was dead certain that Birch was behind the assassin mess from 2 days ago. But Mikael was out of options. Only a Water Awakened could lift the curse. If the Elheims refused to help, Birch planned to dig up dirt on them and use it against them. Valto glanced out the window, a smirk creeping across his face. Looks like the royal family sent us a little something. There were armed guys under the tree, but after the curse he was dealing with, Mikkel couldn't care less about that kind of gift. He raised his hand, and dark energy poured out. It wrapped around the mercenaries' necks and snuffed them out instantly. Mikkel ripped off his blindfold, promising to grant any request of whoever could break this curse. Staring blankly with his blinded, bloodshot eyes, he vowed to get revenge and set things right after that. Duke Elheim greeted Mikkel Birke with a chilly reception, wondering what brought the young man to his doorstep. Even though the guy had important business with him, he said with a smirk that he was ready to leave the duchy right then and there if he wasn't welcome. With that, Michael showed Elheim his official permit to visit. The Duke knew perfectly well that a document like that guaranteed the guest wouldn't cause any trouble for the host's family. And you can't just kick out a visitor with an official permit signed by the temple and the emperor. Michael asked the Duke with a sneer why he looked so spooked, like he was afraid of the Birch family. But Elheim, getting angry, told the guest to cut to the chase and explain the reason for his visit. Then, Michael explained that he'd gone completely blind because of a curse, one that even the holiest people couldn't break. And if he could find a Water Awakened who could lift the curse, he'd gladly accept the help. According to Elheim, it's a little tricky since whoever breaks a curse like that will lose their life. So it has to be a voluntary decision, not something forced. The Duke said he'd wait a month for a volunteer to show up. Mikkel thought about it for a sec, said he understood, and took his leave. He wasn't expecting any promises from the Duke anyway, since he doubted there was even an awakened one in that family. Time ticked by, but no volunteers showed up willing to lift the curse from Mikkel. Valto heard the Duke had gathered all the Water Awakenings together and suggested the master check in on how things were going. Hearing this, Mikhail ordered his assistant to head to the dukedom and gather intel. Left alone, he wondered if his sight was doomed to never return. Mikhail could still use his powers, but his blindness made them hard to control. The sound of something outside snapped him out of it, and Birch jumped up from the couch to see what was up. He walked to the open balcony door, saw Liarte standing there, and announced he wasn't a fan of uninvited guests. Mikhail was about to unleash his power, but the girl spoke up, saying she wasn't an assassin or some awakened pawn sent by the Duke. Birch was struck by her scent, which definitely didn't reek like the water of Elheim. Even though he couldn't see anything, he could sense this pure magical aroma. Without wasting a second, Liarte announced that she was there to free Mikhail from his curse. However, she wanted to know what he could offer her in exchange for restoring his sight. Mikhail smiled and, pressing the girl's hand to his lips, promised to give her anything she asked for. First, Liarte decided to check the condition of his eyes. Having no reason to disagree with someone who could lift his curse, Mikhail sat on the couch and told her to do whatever she thought was necessary. The heroine reached out to remove the blindfold from his eyes. She had to struggle a bit because the knot was tied too tight. Truth is, Mikhail could have taken the blindfold off himself, but for some reason, he didn't want to. Since he couldn't see, the girl's touch felt way more intense, and he was digging her scent. When Liarte finally removed the blindfold, she tilted Mikhail's face up and looked into his eyes. The heroine recoiled, seeing a trace of dark magic in them, a little different from your average curse. It was surrounded by 7 seals that only get stronger over time. Mikhail was worried that someone from the Elheim family knew about something like this, since the Duke always hated ancient dark magic. Actually, Liarte studied forbidden ancient books to help the family without water powers, back when she still hoped to earn their love and recognition. But she wasn't about to admit that, and just changed the subject. They needed to start lifting the curse ass up, or Mikhail could lose his sight for good. With a wave of her hand, the girl awakened the power of water and directed it towards his eyes. Even though it was her first time, Liarte had no more doubts. She really could control water. Mikhail felt a huge power surging through him, still not believing anyone in Elheim could be this strong. After just a few moments, he could feel things getting a little better. Liarte explained that his body couldn't handle having all the seals removed at once, and since she'd decided to remove 1 seal per day, she said goodbye, promising to come back again tomorrow. Mikhail replied that he'd be waiting for her, even though he still didn't know her name. In his past life, Elheim lost half its territory in wars. It all happened because the duchy ignored Mikhail Birch's curse, and he decided to get revenge. Cornered and desperate, the Duke begged his daughter to sacrifice herself. He was convinced Liarte's death would awaken the Spirit Stone, empower her brother, and then they could stand against Birch. Turns out, Leanricius wasn't the real owner of the water power after all. And if Elheim found out about that, there's no way he'd let his daughter leave. According to the Empire's laws, a minor noble from an awakened bloodline belongs to the family until they come of age, but then they get to choose where they live. So, the heroine needed to keep the secret until she could finally be free. Leanricius came to see his sister again, to check on her after the attack. Wearily looking away from her brother, the girl asked what he even cared. The guy was surprised by that, because he used to think Liarte's rudeness was because she felt bad. But now she was clearly doing better, and she was still acting like that. Trying to keep his cool, Leanricius said that her well-being was important to him. The heroine didn't doubt that, since he couldn't properly use his abilities without her. Sighing, the guy told her to get out more and not stay cooped up in that stuffy room feeling like that. With that, he turned and left the room, lost in thought. Leanricius was trying to figure out why his sister had changed so much after she saved him from that attack. He was still standing by the door when Aenlius finally found him to tell him that the Spirit Stone's glow was getting stronger again. He took Leanricius to the temple so he could see it with his own eyes. According to Aenlius, it had all started at dawn the previous day. Leanricius reached out to the stone and found that he couldn't feel a thing. The Spirit Stone wasn't reacting to him at all. The next evening, Liarte came to Birch's place again, just like she promised. When she greeted him by his first and last name, he asked her not to be so formal. He'd prefer it if she just called him by his first name. Liarte just called him Michael right off the bat, and he was blown away by how chill she was about it. He figured that kind of reaction came from either being ice cold or just crazy smart. Michael's eyes were way better. Even a little light used to kill him, so now he could finally get that second seal removed. But then Liardi noticed his hands were shaking like crazy. She covered his hand with hers, telling him not to sweat it and just trust her. Touching his face, she promised she'd get his sight back, no problem. Michael felt how soft and gentle her hands were, so tiny they'd fit right in his. And this fragile thing was trying to calm down a guy who never even got nervous. Who would have thought Birch would hear words like that from someone like her? Since she was the first person to actually get his attention, Michael smiled and said he trusted her. Liarte channeled the power of water, and a cool, refreshing mist washed over Bircha. After finishing removing the second seal of the curse, the girl asked Mikhail how he was feeling and if it had hurt. He replied that thanks to her care, everything had gone completely painlessly. Though, truth be told, that's not what's really got Mikhail's attention. The heroine was afraid of hurting him, so his words made her really happy. Bircha, infamous throughout the empire, couldn't help but be amazed that she treated him like a lamb in need of protection. He really wanted to see this girl with his own eyes as soon as possible. Touching her hair, he promised once again to repay her kindness and asked if she would tell him her name when the curse was lifted. The heroine was surprised that he hadn't figured out who she was yet, but Mikhail confessed that he hadn't even felt the urge to do any investigating. If someone with water powers this strong hasn't gone public yet, there's gotta be a reason. That's why Birch promised not to pry until she was ready to tell him herself. He was sure that one day she'd want to tell him everything. Touched by his kindness, Liarte promised to open up to him before his eyesight was fully restored. Since Linridius let his sister move freely around the estate, the next day she decided to head to the library and look for books about water abilities. The heroine found it weird that before she was reborn, she'd only ever heard bad things about Mikhail Birch. The girl wondered if her rebirth had somehow influenced that. But either way, she was happy that the odds of getting help from him had gone up. Liarte walked into the library, which she hadn't been to in ages, even though she used to come pretty often. It was where she hid from relatives who always hated the unawakened. With a heavy heart, she remembered the day she stopped coming here, but she quickly shook off those thoughts. Right now, she needed to find info on treatments for Mikhail. With each seal, controlling the water powers was getting harder. Suddenly, she sensed she wasn't alone in the library. Turning around, she saw Viamin standing awkwardly by the bookshelves. Besides Liarte and her twin brother Leonricius, the Duke had 3 older sons, the eldest, Einlias, the middle one, Tandrion, and the third, Viamin. Liarte and Viamin were almost the same age, so they often played together as kids. He was a really shy kid who loved reading books. Things got weird between them because Viamin started secretly collecting forbidden books his father had discarded. At first, Liarte just read them too, copying her brother. But then she started studying them, hoping to be useful to the family, even without awakened powers. But they couldn't keep this secret from their father for long. The Duke lost it when he caught them reading forbidden books and demanded to know who brought them to Elheim. Trembling with fear, Viamin claimed he had nothing to do with it. Unable to come up with a better excuse, he pointed at Liarte and blamed everything on her. The Duke knew perfectly well it was a lie, since a little girl with no money or power couldn't have gotten her hands on books like those. Even so, he still punished Liarte, but instead of beating her, their father preferred to inflict injuries on her with the power of water. After that, the heroine couldn't talk to Viamin normally, and only when they were alone would he throw awkward phrases her way. He'd ask his sister how she was feeling, or about the weather, but she'd ignore his questions and run away. And now here he was, standing in front of Liarte, his whole body shaking with awkwardness, asking how she was doing. Looking at him with complete composure, the heroine asked why he was greeting her with such a strange look on his face. Before I was reborn, I was terrified to even be near Viamin after that whole thing. But now, nothing. Stoked that I was even talking to him, my brother blurted out that he heard I was hurt and was super worried. I just told him I didn't have time for this, and if that was it, I had to bounce. Viamin started shaking even harder, because he had so much he wanted to say to me. Finally, he found his balls and yelled after me that he always wanted to say sorry for screwing up back in the day. And even though he said again that he was worried about me, there was no way I was buying it. Turning around to face him, I told him he was only worried about himself. All Viamin cared about was looking like the golden child in Dad's eyes. That's why he pinned the whole blame on me that day, so the Duke wouldn't think any less of him. Viamin was about to say something, but I cut him off, saying I didn't need his apologies. because I wasn't about to forgive him." Her brother tried to stop her, grabbed her arm, but she shook him off. She called him a hypocrite and told him to keep playing the perfect son. Meanwhile, Valto went back to Birch to report everything he'd managed to find out. According to his intel, the spirit stone in the Elheim residence has begun to awaken, and even though Valto didn't have proof, he risked everything to get this news, so he asked him to take his word for it. Still, he figured the boss probably wouldn't believe him and would send him back to Elheim. But to his surprise, nothing like that happened, and Michael just thanked him for the great work. As for the spirit stone, Birch decided to send a letter to his father to get more details from him. Valto even started to suspect that the boss had completely lost it since losing his sight. He noticed Michael was in a good mood, and he confirmed his hunch, saying the day was over and it was time for her to arrive. Valto figured they were talking about the awakened one who lifts curses. Deciding he should probably bail, the guy said he was going to go write a letter to the boss. Mikhail stayed in the room, eagerly waiting for the girl to show up. After a while, he heard a rustling on the balcony and got up from the couch. Bircha, kinda bitter, said he wished he could catch a break for once, then headed straight for the armed killers. Mikhail thought to himself that this didn't feel like an Elheim hit, and these guys were probably sent by whoever cursed him in the first place. Drawing his dagger, he grinned and said that this was all the weapon he needed to handle them. It would have been easier to use his powers, but then he risked attracting Elheim's attention. Gunshots would have alerted the whole building, so Mikhail decided to take care of the mercs quietly. Easily deflecting their attacks, he wondered what the client's angle was. Elheim's always been tight on security, but these guys still managed to slip through. Just then, the door behind Michael creaked open, and he heard his healer's voice. Birch jumped to the door and blocked it with his back, telling her to wait outside, because she was interrupting his cleaning. But then, listening closely, Michael realized something was seriously off. He couldn't figure out why the assassins had suddenly stopped moving, their footsteps just frozen. Standing behind the door, Liarte, knowing what was going down, used her power to freeze the mercenaries in their tracks. The heroine asked Michael if he was all right, and he reminded her that he told her to stay outside. But she knew he was in danger, and she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Entering the room, she noticed the cut on Michael's cheek, and gently touching it, promised to heal him up once everything was settled. Birch blushed, realizing that even with the smell of blood in the air, this girl was worried about him. She kept blowing his mind with her moves, and it was making his heart race. Now, thanks to her help, dealing with these assassins was way easier. Stepping forward, Mikhail told Liarte to stand back, ready to wipe out the mercenaries. But then their petrified bodies suddenly started cracking and crumbling. All the assassins turned to dust in a heartbeat, right at Mikhail's feet, and he asked the girl if she did it. But she was just as surprised, because she hadn't even used her powers. Leaning over the pile, Liarte first thought it was some kind of curse too. But regular spells leave symbols behind, and there were none here, so she figured it could be ancient magic. Since he couldn't sense any more magical energy from the remains, Mikhail knew they weren't a threat anymore. He thanked her for her help and decided to send the knights to investigate what the heck just happened. With the problem handled, Liarte moved on to removing another seal from his curse. Only 5 procedures left, and Michael wished time would just freeze. Crown Prince Lucas Franz wearily glanced at the mercenaries' remains and ordered them dumped, not even surprised they couldn't hold their own. He didn't need the puppets sent to Elheim anymore, so he told them to forget about them. What the prince needed was for Birch and the Elheims to start suspecting each other. The aide agreed with His Highness, but the problem was, nothing was known about Michael's situation at the Duke's estate. Lucas wondered if it was possible those two had suddenly become allies. However, the aide saw no reason to worry, because he was sure that even Elheim couldn't lift such an ancient curse. The prince himself understood that only one person, Linricius, was capable of that. He ordered the aide to urgently find a reason and send Elheim a letter demanding a visit to the duchy. Meanwhile, the Duke called his sons together to discuss the state of the Spirit Stone. Aenlius told his father that the stone was emitting a bright blue glow and that it was beating like a heart, saying the awakening was close. And although he was sure all this had happened thanks to Leonricius, the guy just kept his head down and didn't say a word. Lost in thought about how Liarte hadn't been paying him any attention lately, Leon didn't even hear his father talking to him. When the Duke finally got his attention, he announced that since he was coming of age soon, they needed to find him a wife. Aeneas suggested his brother take a look at a letter from the crown prince, who wanted to visit the duchy. He said that during this visit, they could discuss the matter of his brother's engagement to Princess Ninian. Leon Ricius couldn't have cared less who his wife was, so he had no objections to Princess Ninian as a candidate. It had been clear since early childhood that Ninian liked him, and she was always pretty easy to get along with. But Leon Ricius's thoughts kept drifting back to his sister, who, unlike the princess, was anything but easy. Liarte's changed, become like a stranger, and she's really pulling away from him. The guy just couldn't figure out where he screwed up. Since Leon Ricius didn't object to the engagement with the princess, all that was left was to set a date for His Highness's visit. And since there was a welcome event for Mikhail Bersha coming up soon, the Duke suggested inviting the prince on that very day. He decided to throw a huge banquet at night and hold a hunting competition during the day. Time passed, and the heroine continued to remove the seals of the curse from Mikhail Bersha's eyes, and there were only 2 left. This time, the procedure turned out to be much harder, and the girl asked for more time. Mikhail didn't mind and told her not to rush. The day before, he told Valto that the curse was really being lifted, and he could already see shapes and distinguish colors. Hearing this, the assistant saw no problem with his master participating in the hunting competition. Still, the Duke didn't know Michael's sight was returning, and holding a hunting competition to welcome a blind guy felt off. Birch, though, was sure he'd crush Elheim someday, so he decided to just treat everything like a game. A massive blast of water magic slammed right into Michael's face. He blinked his eyes open and suddenly realized he could see way more clearly. Birch could make out the girl's features as she self-consciously fixed her hair, asking if he could see her. Michael couldn't say a word, just stared silently at Liarte. Feeling himself blush, Birch turned away so the girl wouldn't notice his embarrassment. Unsure if she'd lifted the curse, the heroine asked Michael if he was all right. Still looking away and hiding his face, he replied that he felt much better now. Realizing how ridiculous he looked acting so flustered, Michael told himself to get a grip. Grinning at the girl, he confessed he was happy she was the first person he saw. Taking her hand, Mikhail thanked Liarte for restoring the air of Bersha's sight. He promised his whole family would remember her as their savior and never forget what she did. Mikhail kissed the heroine's hand and added that he was sure she could break the final seal too. When they first met, Birch promised to grant the girl any wish, so now he wanted her to tell him what she wanted in return for her help. Truthfully, the heroine wanted to avoid repeating the regrets she'd suffered in her past life. Doing that alone would be tough, but with Mikhail's help, it was possible. So the heroine declared her name was Liarte Elheim, and she was a disgrace to the duchy. The girl explained she was born unawakened, and therefore considered inadequate. So, the only thing she wanted was to get the hell out of the Elheim dukedom, and she needed Michael's help to do it. After listening to Liarte, Bircha smiled and said she had a beautiful name. Then, he cupped her face in his hand, looked her in the eyes, and promised to help her escape. Sitting by the window, Michael was telling her about himself, but realizing it might be boring her, Birch suggested Liarte tell him about herself. He was curious to know what she liked, and what she, on the other hand, absolutely hated. The question threw her for a loop, and she just blurted out the first thing that popped into her head. She said she liked animals, but the question about whether she liked birds totally threw her off. The heroine suddenly realized she didn't even know anything about herself. Suddenly, Michael waved his hand, and birds started fluttering all around them. He perched one of the birds on his hand, explained they symbolized the Birch family, and asked Liarte if she liked them. The girl smiled and admitted she really did like them a lot. The tension eased, and Mikhail asked when she wanted to leave Elheim, saying he was ready to bolt right now. But Liarte explained that, according to imperial law, she couldn't leave the duchy until she came of age, or she'd be arrested. If they weren't careful, the whole empire could turn against the Birch family, and she told Mikhail not to look at her, like he didn't see a problem with that. Mikhail was planning to ditch this place right after the hunting competition, and he didn't want to leave Liarte here. So, they agreed to escape the duchy on the very day she came of age. Back in Elheim, Tandrian found that absolutely nothing had changed. Aeneas met him at the doorstep, making sure to mention that his brother was late. Greeting him with a smirk, Tandrian asked how the Spirit Stone was doing. This guy was always different from the other Elheim awakened, even though he was one of the best. He hated his natural black hair, so he was always dyeing it. Also, Tandrian headed to the palace to escort and protect Princess Ninian. Aenlias curtly told his brother the Spirit Stone was where it always was. And if Tandrian was so interested, he should have rushed home the second he got the letter. The guy replied he was just too busy. But right now, he wanted to see the stone first thing. Entering the temple, the brothers were stunned by the stone's unusually bright, blazing glow. Seeing this, Tandrian said he would have come back sooner if he'd known how bad things were. But Aenlias stated that the stone hadn't been glowing this intensely before. Tandrian reached out his hand and froze in amazement. The Elheim awakened, families had the ability to control water, a power they called domination. But for some reason, they couldn't control the water filling this place, and it was only getting stronger. Blinded by the stone's glow, Aenlias couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. Suddenly, a silhouette formed through the haze of the mist filling the room. A being with blue hair and eyes, and elven-shaped ears, asked in surprise who they were. He demanded they tell him where the one who awakened him was. Looking at the being with incredible power, the brothers tried to figure out if it was a monster or a god. Finally, Aenlias dared to step forward and ask who he was. The being was outraged that this arrogant fool dared to question him. Extending his hand forward, he blasted the brothers with a powerful surge of water. Knocking them off their feet and using the water like tentacles, the creature lifted Aenlias and Tandarian high above the ground. The water wrapped around their necks, choking off their air supply. The creature announced he was Lord Ryard's 10th weapon and Urin's first contractor. Grinning, he added that he was what people usually called a spirit king. He said if these two were descendants of Urin, their power was pretty pathetic. Releasing the brothers and dropping them back to the floor, the Spirit King asked again who woke him up. Tandrian knew that if they didn't answer, he'd squash them like bugs. Aenlias shouted that the one he was looking for wasn't here and offered to go get him. After a moment's thought, the Spirit King replied that he didn't need him yet and ordered them to bring Uren's successor in 3 days. With that, he vanished into the stone, gone in a flash. The Spirit King's deadline was the day after the banquet and hunting competition. The brothers decided to tell their dad everything that happened, like right now. When Aenlias and Tandrian brought the Duke to the Spirit Stone Temple, the door was locked tight. Elheim called his sons idiots for not figuring out that at least one of them should have stayed inside. Aenlias told his father that the Spirit King ordered them to bring Urin's heir to him in 3 days. But he was sure that if they brought Leonricus here tomorrow, the door would open, even though he hadn't seen his brother in ages and had no idea what he was up to. According to the Duke, Leon had been chasing after Liart this whole time, even invited her to the hunting competition. But right now, it was important to keep the spirit awakening a secret, especially from Birch. The day of the competition arrived, and Mikael showed up with his assistant, wearing a blindfold. A little ways off, Liarte was standing with her twin brother, who was holding her hand and talking to her about something. Mikael was watching everything, and he was definitely not feeling it. Suddenly, Prince Lucas came up behind him and asked the Duke how he was feeling. Turning to face him, the bastard declared he was feeling great and looking forward to a fun hunt. There's only one cursed seal left, so Michael could see everything perfectly now. But Duke Elheim didn't know that yet, which meant the Duke was just going to have to stand there like a scarecrow. Maybe any other time, that's exactly what Michael would have done. But right now, seeing how painfully Leonricius was squeezing Liarte's wrist, he couldn't just let it slide. Sitting under the tree, the heroine wondered how strangely her twin brother had been acting lately. Before she was reborn, there's no way he would have invited her to the hunting competition, and especially wouldn't have said anything like that. Before heading into the woods, Linricius promised to get his sister some game, and asked what kind she wanted. The girl dryly replied that she didn't need anything. My brother grabbed her arm, hard, and told her to figure something out then. So Liardi asked him to bring her a live silver fox, instead of killing it. Leonricius smiled, promised he'd definitely do it, and let go of her arm, leaving marks from his fingers. She specifically asked for an animal that's super hard to find. She didn't get what was up with her brother, but the attention she'd craved before her rebirth was now just getting on her nerves for some reason. Suddenly, someone called her name from behind, and when she turned, she saw Mikael. He stood in front of Liarte without his eye patch, smiling warmly at her. She was surprised he'd been able to track her down here. Mikael sat down next to her and said he somehow just knew he'd find her if he came here, even though he'd really just followed her amazing scent on the breeze. With that, Mikael started chuckling like a goofball, which just made Liarte even more confused. When she asked about his eyes, he said he could see a whole lot better now. Pointing to the bruise on her arm, Birch asked if it hurt bad. And when Liarte admitted she was used to it, Mikkel told her she shouldn't have to get used to stuff like that. Looking at her gently, he added that he didn't want her getting used to pain. She froze, not knowing how to react or what to say in moments like these. So, she just decided to change the subject and asked why he came here. Mikkel replied that, obviously, he wanted to see her. Those words made Liarte think again, because everyone else only saw her as someone who hadn't awakened their powers. But he not only found her in this forest, but also showed her he cared. Realizing that, she smiled and admitted that she was glad he came. For once, Duke Birch himself was flustered, even thrown off balance for a second. Deciding it was time to go, he stood up and asked if Liarte would be at the banquet tonight. Remembering her brother mentioning the banquet, she replied that she'd go if he was going to be there. Michael was stoked, because he'd been hoping to ask her to dance. And even though she said she didn't know how to dance, he promised he'd teach her. Meanwhile, Leon Ricius was roaming through the forest, searching for the silver fox. Finally, he suddenly noticed a tuft of silver fur on the ground. When his father found out who he was hunting, he said Leon had picked himself a real challenge. See, that type had been wiped out a long time ago by order of their ancestor, so now they were practically extinct. Holding the tuft of fur, Leon Ricius figured he might be on the trail of the last silver fox in Elheim. He had to catch that beast, no matter what it took. Maybe then, Liarte would finally go back to normal. Hearing a rustle in the bushes, the guy pushed aside the branches and saw a little fox. Leon Ricius slowly reached out to it, trying not to scare the little critter. But suddenly, a shot rang out, and the fox yelped and fell to the ground. Making sure the animal wasn't dead, just wounded, the guy turned around to see who did it. Seeing Duke Birche picking up the fox from the ground, Leon Ricius asked what this was all about. Smiling and holding the little animal close, Mikkel acted like he had no idea what he was talking about. He said that apparently, the sighted Lord Elheim was way worse at hunting than a blind man. Passing by Leon Ricius, Birch advised him to grab his prey faster next time. Otherwise, he'd just end up losing it again. The heroine sat in her room, glancing sideways at the box, with the dress her brother gave her for the banquet, which she still hadn't opened. She never wore an evening gown in her past life. But now, after being reborn, a lot has changed. Liarte didn't understand why the future had changed, because there was no banquet or prince's visit in that life. Finally opening the box, the girl found a beautiful outfit inside. Turning to the mirror, she saw her untrimmed hair and old worn dress reflected back at her. Surprisingly, before her rebirth, Liarte had absolutely no attachment to life. But now, for her own sake, she was determined to become the author of her own life. The evening after the hunting competition arrived, and an imperial carriage entered the grounds of the Duke's estate. Stepping out, Princess Ninian happily waved to Leon Ricius, whom she hadn't seen in a long time. Elheim greeted Her Highness and took her arm. Afterwards, Leon Ricius gave a special shout-out to Crown Prince Lucas Franz for attending. As Ninian entered the ballroom arm in arm with Elheim, her other brothers came over to greet the princess. Seeing Tandrion in a formal suit, she burst out laughing and said it just wasn't his thing. Meanwhile, Aenlias approached the prince to thank him for coming, and Lucas thanked him in return for the gift. Lucas asked Elheim how the day's hunting competition went. Aenlias replied with a sort of strained smile that everything went off without a hitch. From his expression, the crown prince knew something had gone down at the competition. Lucas quickly scanned the crowd to find Mikkel Birche. He spotted the guy standing a bit away, and seeing the bandage still on the Duke's eyes, confirmed the curse was still in effect. When Ninian asked what he was thinking about, the prince joked that he thought Leon was too good to be betrothed. The princess whispered to her brother that young Elheim seemed a little down today. Ninian asked Leon Ricius if his sister was coming to the banquet, because she wanted to be friends, but he immediately got all gloomy. The prince knew that was exactly why Duke Elheim didn't like his daughter, because she looked so much like the heir, but never awakened. But his innocent and naive sister didn't suspect any of it. Suddenly, the hall got way too noisy for some reason, and all the guests turned their heads, jaws dropped, in the same direction. Aenlias turned around too, to see what was going on. Turns out, all the aristocrats were staring at Liarte, who was coming down the stairs in a fancy ball gown. Not just her brothers, but Duke Elheim himself saw his late wife and his daughter. Ninian couldn't hide how amazed she was, because the girl looked so unbelievably stunning that she didn't even recognize her at first. Vyamin saw his sister in a dress like that for the first time and couldn't take his eyes off her. Tandarion thought his sister's perfect posture and manners made her seem like the ideal aristocrat. Leonritius silently watched the girl, who since childhood had desperately hidden the fact that she hadn't awakened her powers. She always craved love from her family, even when they treated her badly. But the more she tried to fit in, the more it annoyed Leonritius, and the colder he became. But now, for some reason, Liarde herself was giving him a piercing, icy stare. Trying to change things, even just a little, Leonritius approached his sister and asked her to dance. However, Mikhail Bersha suddenly blocked his way, stepping between them and also inviting Liarte to dance. Elheim's mind flashed back to the Duke's advice. Next time, move fast, or you'll lose her again. Only now did he understand what those words meant, and he clenched his teeth in anger. The heroine smiled, offered Mikhail her hand, and said she'd be delighted to dance with him. That's when Leonritius realized his sister was slipping away from him for good. As he twirled the girl around the dance floor, Michael noticed how stunning she looked tonight, and she returned the compliment. Sensing someone's intense gaze, the heroine turned and saw the crown prince watching them. Even before her rebirth, the royal family dabbled in ancient magic. She understood that the attack on Leon, the curse on Michael, and the mercenaries reduced to bone dust all involved ancient powers only the ruling family could wield. All of this implied that the royal family was behind everything, and maybe Crown Prince Lucas came to the duchy today to make sure the curse on Birch was working. Liarte asked Michael if he could really dance so openly in public. After all, the one responsible for his curse is right here in this room. Initially taken aback, Bircha suddenly smiled, because he was planning to tell her everything later, but Liarte seemed to have figured it all out herself. He said he didn't care, because those people were convinced he couldn't see anything. For Mikhail, it was way more important that Liarte come to Birch when she came of age. Looking the girl straight in the eyes through her blindfold, he offered to take her with him. However, Leonritius, who was watching them, had completely different plans in mind. He was dead set that once he came of age and took over as duke, he'd chain his sister to Elheim and never let her leave. The princess was tired of dancing and suggested Leonritius take a little break. She got flustered seeing the prince and the duke talking about something, figuring they were discussing their engagement. His Highness had actually already arranged with Elheim to send all the necessary paperwork, but Leonritius suddenly jumped into the conversation and asked them to hear him out first. Everyone looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was up to, and that's when Leonritius, with total conviction in his voice, suggested they get engaged after she came of age. The prince agreed that an engagement with someone underage wasn't the best idea. He remarked that the duke had a very serious and prudent younger son. Stepping aside, Ninian thanked Leonritius for looking out for her, and even though the younger duke wasn't even thinking about postponing the engagement because of the princess, he was glad everyone thought so. The truth is, he just wanted to speed up the coming-of-age ceremony. The Elheim family valued exceptional water abilities, and since Leonritius was the strongest awakened, he was destined to take the duke's place. And after that, he planned to use his power to make sure Liarte didn't try anything funny. The heroine entered a room she hadn't been in for a long time, but the place was forever etched in her memory. After all, this was where the duke usually disciplined his children. Slamming the door open, her father demanded Liarte explain why she was dancing with Birch at the banquet. But she didn't see a problem with dancing with Mikhail. In that instant, the duke suddenly realized something about his daughter had changed, because she used to be such a withdrawn kid. He figured it was just another one of her little, attention-grabbing stunts. Her father started yelling that Liarte better not use Birch for that. She knows how much he can't stand them. According to the duke, he never considered her a real Elheim, so he doesn't have to treat her like a daughter. Against his expectations, Liarte fired back, saying that in that case, she wouldn't consider him her father either. The duke couldn't believe his ears. She'd never dared say anything like that before. After all, Liarte wanted to be part of the Elheim family more than anything. Completely thrown, the duke asked if she even understood what she was saying. Giving her father a cold stare, the girl reminded him that he himself had said she wasn't part of Elheim. And if that was the case, she didn't understand why she had to follow the rules of the duchy and stay away from Bersha. The duke was furious at the garbage Liarte was spouting in that room. The heroine had had to listen to lectures in this disciplinary room until her ears ached more than once. This music room was the Duchess's favorite place in the estate right up until her death. Elheim always blamed Liarte for his wife's death, claiming it happened because the daughter was born unawakened. But the heroine had heard that her mother's condition was already bad after giving birth to 3 sons. And after the Duchess gave birth to twins, she passed away. The heroine asked her father if her mother's last wish was really to get revenge on the child who killed her. Then she declared to the stunned Duke that if he had nothing more to say, she was leaving. Liarte stormed out, slamming the door, and Elheim just stood there for a while, head hanging low. He was still stuck on his theory that his wife died because she gave birth to someone without powers. That night, Liarte removed the last cursed seal from Michael's eyes. Bircha noticed she was in a bad mood and asked her what was wrong. She told him she'd popped into the disciplinary room earlier that day for a bit. Worried he was making her uncomfortable, Michael checked her over carefully, but didn't see any signs of her being roughed up. Then he smiled and offered her his shoulder if she was just feeling down. Silence filled the room, and Bircha figured he'd overstepped. But then, out of nowhere, Liarte threw herself against his chest. Holding onto Michael, she told him how she'd told her father she didn't consider herself part of their family anymore. The guy couldn't believe Liarte was opening up to him, actually sharing what was on her mind. He hugged her tight, trying to calm her down, telling her she didn't have to impress people who didn't respect her. Then, Mikkel asked her what exactly the Elheims had been doing to her. The girl just spaced out, not even knowing where to begin. The very first memory that popped into her head was from when she was a kid. She'd blacked out, and when she woke up, she was near a cabin in the mountains. It was snowing, freezing cold, and she was completely alone. Since there was food in the cabin, Liarte figured they just wanted to hide her away, not kill her. After a long time, the Elheims took her back, but only to use her as a tool for Leonricius's powers. If it wasn't for that, they probably would have just left her in that cabin, which honestly might have been better, because Liarte was constantly getting punished, and living with the constant taunts, anger, and indifference was rough. Still, she always tried her hardest to earn their love and be part of the family, even though they were just using her. But now, Liarte couldn't care less about anything related to the Elheim family. After listening to her, Michael suddenly pulled her close and gave her a tight hug. He promised he'd definitely help her escape from the Elheim duchy. The heroine thanked Michael and hugged him even tighter. Suddenly, Birch asked what she wanted to do once she got away from here. The girl shyly admitted that she wanted to see the ocean, since she'd always dreamed about it. Michael was amused by such an innocent wish and playfully pinched her cheeks. Smiling, he declared that Liarte would definitely see the sea, and swore on the name of Birch that he'd come to get her on her coming-of-age day. The day to meet the Spirit King arrived, and the Duke, along with his sons, approached the door of the sacred room. The door was unlocked this time, and everyone rushed inside, eager to see what was next. When the Duke first heard about the awakening of the Spirit King, he couldn't even fathom the extent of his power. But now, he'd witnessed the unbelievable force of water with his own eyes. Kneeling before the Spirit King, Aeneas announced that he had brought the one who awakened him. Casting a displeased glance at Leonricius, the Spirit King declared that I couldn't have been the one. Soaring high into the air, he called the whole thing ridiculous. Keeping his eyes locked on the stunned Leonricius, the Spirit King called him a fake. He was furious that the Elheim dared to try and trick him, bringing him the wrong person, not the one who actually woke him. Rage clouded the Spirit King's eyes, and he looked ready to wipe them all out. But the Duke cried out, saying they didn't understand what he was talking about, because Leonricius possessed the Spirit Stone. The Spirit King sensed the Elheims weren't lying. They genuinely didn't understand what was going on. Still, he was sure that Urin's reincarnation, the one who woke him up, was close by. He declared the true owner of the Spirit Stone was in this castle and ordered them brought to him. The Duke promised to do it, even though he had no clue who it could be. After that, all the awakened Elheim family members were brought to the Spirit King one by one, but he kept saying the right person wasn't among them. Sitting in his study, the Duke was racking his brain, trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong, and how Leonricius couldn't be the stone's owner. Aeneas suggested his father check the low-level awakened ones. Looking at his brother's serious face, he told him not to sweat it too much. After all, even without being the Spirit Stone's owner, Leonricius was still the Duke's heir. Tandrian needed to head back to the Imperial Palace following the princess, but he promised to return for his brother's coming-of-age ceremony. The knight showed up to announce Duke Bircha was leaving Elheim, cutting off the father's talk with his sons. Valto wasn't sure if they should leave earlier than planned, but Mikhail didn't see the point in sticking around, since the curse was totally lifted. Besides, he still had a ton to get ready for Liarte's arrival. Out of nowhere, Leonricius came out to see Duke Birch off. Mikhail smirked and said it was a real honor, and now his journey would definitely be smooth sailing. Stroking the silver fox cub in a showy way, he added that, thanks to the Elheim's hospitality, he hadn't had a single dull day in the duchy. Looking at the little critter, Leonricius asked if Mikhail was planning on taking it with him. Still smirking, the Duke replied that, of course, he always takes everything that belongs to him. Getting into the carriage, Mikhail said goodbye to Leonricius and that he'd see him around. But the dude just said they probably wouldn't cross paths again. After a short pause, Leon added that went for both him and his sister. But Mikhail was sure the Elheims would be seeing him again, no doubt. It had been a few months since Birch skipped town and left the duchy. Nothing much had happened since then, except Leonridius switched his sister's room to something more suitable for a lady of her status. Hearing her brother's footsteps behind her, she asked what he wanted. But according to Leonridius, he didn't need a reason to visit his sister. Since their coming-of-age ceremony was coming up soon, he asked Liarte if there was anything she wanted. Without turning to face him, she said she didn't get why he was suddenly so interested in what she wanted. Leonridius asked her to stop staring out the window, like she was about to ditch this place any minute. Leaning over his sister, he smirked and said if she thought she could escape Elheim, she could forget about it, because it was never gonna happen. Even if Liarte was on her deathbed, she'd have to meet her end in the duchy. Remembering Michael's promise, she thought that this time, her brother was dead wrong. There was no way she was repeating that fate a second time. She was definitely getting out of this place. Meanwhile, the princess was wandering around the castle, looking for Tandrian. Hearing her call his name, Elheim instantly popped up in front of Ninian, grinning like a fool. The girl got pissed that he'd hidden his appearance with magic again, even though she'd told him a million times not to. Tandrian replied that he was just trying to help the princess without getting in the way, like he was just heir. But she was sick of those excuses. Elheim turned around and spotted the prince in the hallway, followed by some dude in a cloak. The princess started excitedly telling Tandarian about the new maid. But before she could even blink, he vanished into thin air again. The castle dungeon was cold and dark, lit only by torches near the stairwells. As they descended, the prince's companion reminded him that the Leonricius ceremony was just around the corner, only 3 days away. His Highness replied that Ninian should be thrilled about that. Finally, they reached a tall, massive red door, flanked by terrifying gargoyles perched on the columns beside it. Count Fedez looked up and froze, stunned. Before them, levitating in the air, was the half-blood spirit queen, passed down in the ruling family from generation to generation. The prince informed the count that he intended to make her whole and then claim her power for himself, all so that not even the awakened could challenge the absolute imperial authority. Fades vowed that everything would go exactly as His Highness wished. Suddenly, the prince ordered a bottle brought to him, which surprised the count, who hadn't expected him to do that himself. But Lucas reminded him about the special thing with red-eyed royals. Neither awakened powers nor curses affect them. Still, Fades advised His Highness to be careful. Lucas opened the bottle and started scooping in the black pollen, which had a special layer to it. One whiff, or even a touch, and a living thing would completely lose its mind from it. After collecting enough pollen, the prince closed the bottle. On the way out of the dungeon, he asked the count how Birch was doing, and he replied that the duke was still behind locked gates. Lucas was pleased that the old man would never see a bright future again, since his heir was blinded, and they deserved it. Neither Fedez nor the crown prince noticed that Tandrian had been watching them the whole time. And now Elheim knew that the crown prince was hiding another spirit king. Tandrian got back home the day before his coming-of-age ceremony, and he was shocked they still hadn't found the spirit stone's owner. The duke told his son they brought every awakened person to the spirit king, but it didn't work. Tandrian actually came to Elheim to get news about the spirit stone, and he was bummed things were still the same. The imperial family's spirit queen's power was nothing compared to the water spirits, but they still had to keep an eye on them. Suddenly, Leonricius asked his father what he planned to do when Liarte came of age. Aenlius didn't get why his brother was even talking about her, though he noticed he'd been obsessed with their sister lately. The duke replied that if Leonricius could use his power without Liarte after the ceremony, they wouldn't need her anymore, and he'd kick her to the curb. But to his surprise, his son suddenly asked him to let her stay in the family. The Duke started explaining that by law, they couldn't keep Liarte after she came of age if she didn't want to stay. Leonritius reminded his father he'd said Liarte was his property, and now he didn't want to hear anything about laws. Aeneas was floored by the crazed look in his eyes as he said all that. Tandarion backed his brother up, saying he was free to do whatever he wanted, and they could rough up Liarte if she didn't listen. It was clear he still thought Leonritius was the real owner of the Spirit Stone. Suddenly, Aeneas remembered that when other awakened people were brought before the Spirit King, he'd just say they weren't the right ones. But only when it came to Leonricius did he use the word fake. The coming-of-age ceremony was just a day away, and the heroine needed to figure some things out before then. Liarte noticed that all the awakened of Elheim had been summoned to the temple lately, and she was curious about what was going on there. The girl stopped in front of the door, which only a direct awakened descendant could open. But when she reached out, the door gave way immediately and swung open. Stepping inside, the heroine found some kind of dormant creature there. It looked a lot like the guy Liarte saw right before she was reborn. Suddenly, the creature opened its eyes and lunged at her, stoked that she finally came to him. The Spirit King called the heroine his master and his only contractor. Liarte looked at him, surprised, not remembering ever making a deal with him, saying that wasn't true. The creature touched the girl's hand with his palm. Her whole arm instantly lit up with a bright blue glowing design. It was a mark Liarte etched into her soul, so he'd recognize her even after reincarnation, because they promised each other they'd meet again. She was his first contractor and the reincarnation of the head of the first family, Uren. The Spirit King took Liarte's hand to read her memories. After seeing them, he said he'd love to give those guys in that family a piece of his mind, and then some. And on top of everything, these guys couldn't even recognize the real boss and kept clinging to the fake. The Spirit King would have wiped out all of Elheim if Liarte had asked him to. His power could have leveled the whole empire. But she told him not to, said those guys weren't even worth the trouble. Besides, Liarte was planning on ditching this place anyway, so she asked him to keep their meeting on the down low. The Spirit King already knew she was heading to Bircha. He wanted to go with her, but the thing is, a long time ago he split himself into two parts. If the Spirit King leaves this place, it'll break the seal. Before he could even explain properly, they heard someone's voice from behind the door. It was time for her to bounce, so the Spirit King promised to explain everything in detail next time. And even though he couldn't be with Liarte, he genuinely wished her all the best. The girl promised the Spirit King they'd meet again for sure, and headed for the exit. After seeing her off, he thought about how much those fools would regret it when they found out exactly who they'd kicked out. The day of the coming-of-age ceremony arrived, and the duchy's ballroom was packed with guests. Viamin was seriously surprised to see Liarte at the event, but Leonritius reminded his brother that he and his sister were twins, and this was their shared celebration. Still, Viamin couldn't figure out why Liarte had knights guarding her, like she was some kind of criminal. He thought it was going way too far. The family had no right to hold back awakened individuals who'd reached adulthood. Smirking at Viamin, Leonritius asked him since when he started considering Liarte a member of their family. The guy said he was right, apologized, and decided to go over to their father. Left alone, Leonritius looked at his sister again, thinking, not for the first time, that this was exactly where she belonged. Liarte was supposed to stay hidden, like she was the shadow, desperately craving the light. The princess approached Leonricius to congratulate him on coming of age. She looked at the future duke, hoping they'd be engaged soon. Ninian kept rambling on about something, but Leonricius wasn't listening. He was still watching Liarte. The heroine constantly felt her brother's unwavering gaze on her. Under the guise of caring, he even assigned her guards, and she wondered if Mikhail could really help her under these circumstances. The duke was chatting idly with the guests when a knight suddenly burst into the hall. Throwing himself to his knees before his grace, he reported that an uninvited carriage had arrived at the castle. The duke was floored to learn that Birch had shown up at the event. A moment later, Mikhail actually appeared in the hall, accompanied by his loyal assistant. Grinning, he said he was stoked he made it before the ceremony wrapped up. The prince was totally floored to see Birch without the blindfold. It meant the curse was gone. The duke was livid that Michael dared to show up in Elheim uninvited. He was shaking with rage, promising Birch would pay for what he'd done. Michael wasn't fazed at all, and just smirked, saying he was only back to pick up what he left behind. Leonritius, tense as hell, asked what he was talking about. Michael turned and silently looked at Liarte. who was standing a little ways away. Then, he held out his hand to her, saying he was there to keep his promise, and asked her to come with him to Birch. Apologizing for being late, Michael added that they should get going. Before Liarte could take a step towards him, a wave of water erupted between them. "Who do you think you are, Mikhail, snatching my sister like that?" Leonrichus boomed, flexing his power. "Birch ain't getting what's mine," he snarled. "And I'll take you down if you try." Leonrichus's power surged towards Mikhail, but never even touched him. Suddenly, a massive wave of energy erupted, pushing the water back from Bircha. Ainlea strained to see who in the hall was packing that kind of heat. Leonrichus froze, finally spotting the source of the blast. Standing in the middle of the towering wave, Liarte frowned. "That's enough, everyone! Knock it off!" With everyone in the room stunned silent, the heroine suddenly started moving. Mikhail grabbed her hand, but she said, "Before I head to Birch, I've got something I need to take care of." The guy let go, and Liarte walked straight towards her father. The Duke was dying to know what power she'd just used, but the heroine totally blew off his question. She told the Duke straight up that she was cutting all ties with the Elheim dukedom, effective immediately. Since Liarte was officially an adult, legally, none of them could hold her there. 21 years, counting her time before she was reborn, the heroine had lived through hell, but now it was finally over. Liarte wasn't about to be anyone's substitute anymore. Viamine and Tandarion, who'd never seen power like that before, were totally stunned by what was happening. Announcing she was done, the heroine suggested to Michael that they head to Bersha. Smiling and without wasting a second, the Duke took the girl's arm and led her out of the hall. Liarte smiled, knowing she was finally going to see the ocean. Sitting in the carriage, Michael was thinking about how the Elheim family had tried to hold on to the girl until the bitter end. The Duke bolted after his daughter, almost dropping to his knees in front of her. But as far as he was concerned, those fools didn't deserve the treasure they'd been taking for granted all this time. Liarte shouldn't have just been some backup plan for that jerk Leonrichus. A girl's voice snapped Mikhail out of his thoughts. The heroine couldn't believe she'd actually left Elheim. Birch gently touched Liarte's hair and promised to make her forget everything she'd gone through in that place. Grinning, he added that he'd be right there with her. And just then they were told they'd arrived. Mikhail asked the girl if she was ready and opened the carriage door, which immediately flooded with golden sunlight. The heroine peeked out and saw the sun setting over the ocean horizon, painting the water crimson. Liarte couldn't tear her eyes away from the beauty, smiling at the feeling of freedom washing over her. The sun had completely dipped below the horizon, but she was still standing there on the shore. The ocean was way bigger and more beautiful than she ever imagined from those fairy tales. Liarte thanked Mikhail and told him she was glad they met. She asked him to look after her when they got to Bershi. Mikhail got flustered and turned away so she wouldn't see how red he was getting. Coming closer to Liarte, he confessed that he missed her a ton while he was in Bersha. Gently touching his face, she said she missed him too. Pressing her hand tighter to his cheek, Mikhail asked her to be with him always and to come to the sea together, again and again. Meanwhile, Leonrichus was sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by furniture he'd trashed in a fit of rage. Trying to figure out where things went wrong, he realized Mikhail had been a problem from the very beginning. Leonrichus should have seen the writing on the wall the second Birch snatched that silver fox right from under his nose. We should have kicked him out the moment he asked Liarte to dance. The Duke walked up to his son and just stared at him for a long moment, not saying a word. Looking around, he made it clear he was not happy with how this coming-of-age ceremony went down, considering it was supposed to be the biggest celebration for the Elheim family. Still, the Duke was blown away by the raw power of Liarte's water abilities. He turned and ordered his sons to follow him, saying they needed to figure out what all this meant. The 5 of them headed to the temple to talk to the Spirit King. The blue-haired being was sitting in the middle of the room, looking all bummed out. Seeing the Elheims, he admitted he felt like tearing them limb from limb, because thanks to them, those boneheads, Urin's descendant, had left the estate. The Duke asked him to go easy on them and explain what it really meant to be the master of the Spirit Stone. The Spirit King asked the Elheims how they interpreted Urin's will. According to the Duke, the Covenant says the true master of the Spirit Stone will appear one day, awaken it, and restore the family's power. Before he could finish, the Spirit King declared that was all wrong and began to tell the real story of the will. Back in Urin's time, the first master, the Spirit Stone gates opened. Back then, spirits roamed the earth freely. interacting with people, and sharing their power with those who made contracts with them. There were even those who made contracts with spirit kings, not just regular spirits, and they were called the Awakened. People got along great with the spirits until one of the spirit kings fell, and the gates were sealed shut. Hearing this, Tandrion wondered if this was the same being he'd seen in the Crown Prince's basement. After that, all the spirits returned to their world, and the Awakened, naturally, couldn't use their powers anymore. The Elheims, however, managed to preserve their power only thanks to Urin. Urin, the eldest of the family, was a little off her rocker and couldn't become a spirit master even after coming of age, just like Liarte, who the whole family hated so much. The Spirit King smirked, looking at the Duke's shocked face. He asked how they all felt now that the true mistress of the Spirit Stone, the one they'd been waiting for, had left them. After all, they all called her a fake, when all along someone else was the phony. Pointing at Leanne Ricious, the Spirit King suddenly declared that even in the womb, he'd completely drained her of all her life force. The Duke turned to his son, and horror was etched on his face. On top of everything else, the Spirit King accused Leonricius of continuing to live happily after birth, this time leeching off his sister's power. Furthermore, the Spirit King stated that without Liarte, he wouldn't share any water power with them. For a moment, absolute silence reigned in the temple, and then, the silence was shattered by the wild, insane laughter of Duke Elheim. He couldn't keep his feet, just collapsed on the floor, whining about how he had to get Liarte back. Dawn had already broken when Mikkel's carriage finally rolled up to Birsha. She was asleep on the Duke's shoulder when he woke her to tell her they'd arrived. The girl peeked out the window and saw a huge, gorgeous estate. Helping Liarte down from the carriage, Mikkel admitted he hadn't told her something, but he didn't get a chance to finish, because Duke Carmen Bircha came running to greet them. The guy grinned and said he'd been dying of anticipation, waiting to finally welcome their benefactor. Mikkel whispered an apology for not warning Liarte that his dad was super eager to meet her. She bowed and thanked Duke Birch for welcoming her. Mikkel put his arm around her shoulder and told her to chill out and not be so uptight. The Duke backed up his son, saying they were the ones who should be looking after Liarte and showing her their gratitude. He took the girl's hand and pressed his lips to the back of it. Carmen thanked her for restoring the sight of Birch's only heir, but Liarte replied that Mikhail had also been a huge help to her in return. They looked at each other, and a warm smile spread across their faces. The Duke didn't miss that glance, and he smiled too. After that, Carmen suggested they head inside the estate, since it had been a long journey, and he had something special prepared for Liarte. The heroine was blown away by how lavish the room prepared for her was. She looked around, trying to figure out what the Duke meant when he said Liarte would understand everything once she entered her bedroom. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and a woman's voice from the other side said that Mr. Carmen had sent her. The door swung open, and in walked Marilyn, a maid assigned specifically to attend to the guest. Our girl recognized her instantly. In her past life, when Birch attacked the kingdom of Elheim, this woman single-handedly took out hundreds of soldiers. Liarte was certain it was her, and couldn't figure out why they'd assign a stone-cold killer to her. Marilyn asked her not to judge too harshly, since her maid skills might be a little lacking, but she could protect her mistress like no one else, and that's exactly why the Duke sent her to Liarte. Hearing that, our heroine smiled and asked Marilyn to take good care of her. First, the girl offered to help her mistress change, and then escort her to the garden. Mikkel was sipping tea with his father in the sun-drenched garden, eagerly awaiting Liarte's arrival. After a while, the girl finally joined them, apologizing for being late. Since Mikhail didn't know exactly what she liked, he told the chef to prepare a ton of different desserts. But for some reason, Liarte looked bummed out, and he figured none of the pastries hit the spot. Both Birch father and son were floored when she admitted she'd just never seen food like that before and didn't know how to eat it. The girl smiled and just asked them to show her how it's done. Mikkel looked at her with pity, but quickly pulled himself together. He smiled back and promised he'd definitely teach her everything, little by little. Stabbing a piece of cake with his fork, Mikkel explained it was a light and sweet sponge cake and held it out to Liarte. At first, she cautiously and carefully tasted the first bite, but her eyes suddenly lit up from the amazing flavor. Carmen and her son were happy that the girl liked the treat. Tea time came to an end, and Liarte had fully enjoyed the desserts she had never eaten before. The girl didn't even realize how fast time flew by. She was heading back to her room, lost in pleasant thoughts, when suddenly a loud roar echoed from behind. When Liarte turned around, the hallway was already silent, and at first, she thought she'd imagined it. But a moment later, the roar came again, and the heroine was sure she hadn't been mistaken. Noticing that her mistress had gone pale, Marilyn asked if she was all right. Liarte replied that she'd heard the roar of a beast and was surprised the maid hadn't heard it. But Marilyn insisted she hadn't heard anything, and besides, they didn't keep any animals in the duchy. Stating that it was late, she asked her mistress to return to her room. Meanwhile, Carmen, sitting in his study, was reading a letter filled with demands. The aristocrats, led by the Elhims, who had lost the strongest awakened of all time, were demanding Liarte be returned to them. The Duke asked his assistant, Aleph, how he should interpret the Crown Prince's interference in this matter, and crumpled the letter in his hand. The guy mentioned the Crown Prince wants Birch's downfall, and he's the type who'd marry just to get a powerful awakened on his side. But Carmen thought the prince wanting to marry Liarte was totally out of line. That girl never got treated right back in the duchy, and she finally broke free and saw the light. Even if she wasn't a benefactor to the Birch family, they'd never let her go back to that hellhole. The Duke tossed the letter in the trash and told Aleph not to bring him that kind of mail again. Plus, Carmen said to tell whoever sent it that he'd personally make sure they couldn't write anything like that ever again. Lying in bed, she was thinking how her coming to Birch felt like some kind of dream. There was so much stuff around her that she never would have experienced if she hadn't come. Now she finally understood what the maid had said earlier. To Marilyn, Birch was like an angel with a warm heart and a total lifesaver all rolled into one. The girl was sure the duchy would be just as good for the lady. Marilyn was once kidnapped by a group of assassins and lost her chance at a normal life. If Birch hadn't wiped out that group, she'd still be stuck in that awful existence. Marilyn smiled at Liarte and said she'd live a normal life here too. She was definitely happy to be able to relax in Birch. I mean, in her past life, she was taking out even royalty, no holds barred. The main character wondered what could have changed Marilyn so much, and how to stop it. Something big must have happened to make the people of Birch lose their minds. Suddenly, the roar Liarte heard in the hallway echoed again, and she jumped up. Certain she hadn't imagined it, she went to the window. She was dead set on figuring out where that noise was coming from. When Liarte stepped out of her room, she bumped into a knight right at the door. After learning that the lady couldn't sleep and had come out for a stroll, he offered to escort her, but she told him everything was fine and he could go back to guarding the castle. Still, the knight insisted on accompanying her, since Liarte wasn't familiar with the estate yet. Not wanting to argue anymore, she agreed, and they set off for a walk around the grounds. She headed in the direction where she thought that weird growling sound was coming from. The sound came again, and Liarte realized it was coming from the tower of a small building. She immediately rushed over there, despite the knight trying to stop her and asking her not to go so far. The girl had just touched the door when someone called her name from behind. Liarte turned around and saw Duke Carmen standing right there. A little later, they were walking together, but her head was spinning with all kinds of thoughts. There was a small building behind the main mansion, and the Duke was clearly up to something there. Carmen didn't miss the girl's pensive expression. He smiled and asked if she wanted to know what he'd been doing. Since Liarte doubted he'd give her a straight answer, the Duke said he'd give her something else instead. Carmen reached into his pocket, pulled out a piece of candy, and held it out to her. He explained it was chocolate, like the kind she'd had earlier, and asked her to try it. As Liarte took the candy and thanked him, the Duke asked why she was outside so late. The heroine hesitated, wondering if she should tell him the truth. But if Marilyn said she didn't hear any roaring, it was pretty obvious the Duke would say the same. Still, this was a perfect chance to get closer to Carmen, so Liarte just said she couldn't sleep. She asked if His Grace had performed ceremonies in that house before, and the Duke said he had. Turning to her, he smirked and said he wouldn't spill all the beans, even if she kept staring at him like that. Then, Carmen snapped his fingers, and a knight instantly appeared beside them. He told him to escort the lady to her room, since it was getting super late. Liarte couldn't shake the feeling that the Duke was deliberately trying to get rid of her. The heroine was now even more convinced that Birch was hiding something in that house. The next day, while Liarte was sitting in the garden, Marilyn came up to her. She asked the lady not to go for walks so late anymore, because the Duke had given her a real dressing down for it. Suddenly, Mikhail showed up. He'd come out to the garden the second he heard she was there. Liarte admitted she really loved this beautiful, wide-open garden. Sitting down next to her, Mikkel noticed a piece of candy in her hand and asked where she got it. She told him the Duke gave it to her during their walk last night. The guy figured his dad probably grabbed the candy, thinking he'd run into Liarte. She's the only one in the whole place who eats sweets. His grandpa used to do the same thing, always carrying around candy. It hit her then that she'd only met the Duke and Mikhail from the Birch family so far. But Aron Birchi should still be alive, right? Liarte hadn't seen him around the estate, and the servants never mentioned him. Noticing she'd suddenly gone quiet, Mikhail asked if she was okay. Then Liarte confessed she'd heard a weird scream last night. She thought she heard someone crying in the small house behind the main estate. Mikhail thought about it for a second, then stood up and suggested she go with him. Since Liarte was curious about what was in that house, he decided to take her there. But then Marilyn jumped in, saying that was out of the question. It's way too risky and she could get hurt. Mikhail thanked her for her concern, but said he was a little bummed she didn't trust him more. Marilyn apologized and admitted she was being dumb. Reaching the mysterious house, Mikhail pulled out a key and warned Liarte not to freak out too much. He told her to stick close to him no matter what happened inside. As soon as they stepped inside, she could feel how freezing it was. She started shivering, and Mikhail, putting his arm around her shoulder, told her she had nothing to worry about. Liarte spun around and suddenly saw a chair in the middle of the room with a bound man sitting in it. Mikhail told her to say hello to his grandfather, Aron Birche. She was stunned, not understanding what could have happened to make them keep the head of the family like this. Then, Mikhail explained that his grandfather had lost his mind, even though he was perfectly fine just a few years ago. The family didn't know why it happened or how to fix it, so the Duke ordered him locked up. Liarte walked up to the old man and started staring intently at his face. The man had red pupils and fangs like a wild animal. She froze because she recognized those symptoms. At the start of the First War declared by the Birches, the royal family and the Elheims were sure they'd win. But as soon as the fighting started, they got completely wrecked. During the war, everyone feared Mikhail Birche, who they called the battlefield demon. And just when everyone was freaking out, totally clueless how to stop him, the Crown Prince came up with a plan. He decided to use magic pollen against Birch, the kind that drives you absolutely bonkers if you inhale it. This poison could turn a person into a total wild animal. But back then, the Crown Prince couldn't get the pollen on Mikhail, and soon after, it turned out that the Awakened could actually flush that poison out of their system. In the heroine's past life, Prince Lucas Franz was the only one who possessed that kind of pollen. So what happened to Aron Birch? It was definitely His Highness's doing. Suddenly, the old guy yanked at his chains and with a wild roar, lunged toward Liarte. The heroine instinctively took a step back and instantly found herself in Mikhail's arms. A young guy named Franz, who came running in at that moment, apologized to the young master for leaving his post. He explained that they had gone scouting and returned as soon as they heard the scream. Once they were sure everything was cool, the guys noticed the boss wasn't alone. Mikhail told them not to stare so hard at Liarte and to introduce themselves first. Hans and Andre met the lady and said they were Aron Birch's assistants. They explained that the old man saved them and Marilyn, and after what happened to him, they couldn't just ditch him. Mikhail asked Liarte if she was all right, because she didn't look too good. The heroine smiled and admitted she was just a little spooked. But really, she was trying to figure out exactly how the Crown Prince could have poisoned Aron. He could only do it through someone the old man trusted, which meant one of these two could be a mole. Meanwhile, Lucas Franz was wondering why Liarte was the awakened one. If he'd known that before, he would have flipped her to the royal family. Now she's with Birch, and all his work with that curse on Mikhail's eyes just went down the drain. Just then, the prince was informed he had a visitor, and Lucas blew a gasket, wondering what moron would show up without an appointment. Entering the hall, Carmen Birch smirked and announced that he was that moron. Instead of a greeting, Lucas sniped that the Duke had finally gotten his act together, apparently becoming even more arrogant now that he'd nabbed himself an awakened one. Carmen smiled, replying that His Highness must be losing his mind because of it. But Lucas Franz warned him that he wasn't going to put up with that kind of insolence. Bircha, in turn, warned that he wouldn't just sit back if they kept sending him letters begging him to release the girl. With those words, he gripped the hand of Count Fides, who was standing next to him, tightly. The Duke declared that next time, he wouldn't stop at just breaking the hand that sent those letters. So Carmen strongly advised the prince not to push him to do something even worse. Lucas was outraged that Birch dared to threaten him. The Duke replied he wouldn't dare threaten His Highness. It was just a request for a favor. Carmen, hoping letters like that wouldn't reach Birch again, bowed and left. Once the Duke was gone, Lucas told the Count, who was shaking in pain, that they had to teach that cocky jerk a lesson. The Crown Prince told Fides to order their guys to make Aaron Birch pay. Big time. Watching the maid tidy up her room, the heroine mulled over everything she'd learned the night before. Hans and Andre said the master saved them and Marilyn, so they couldn't abandon him now. Aaron couldn't inhale the black pollen on his own, and only people above suspicion were near him, so one of those three must be responsible. Marilyn noticed that the mistress hadn't been herself since returning from that house. Even though the maid seemed worried, Liarte quickly assured her that everything was fine. After thinking for a bit, the heroine asked Marilyn to arrange a meeting with Master Carmen. Meanwhile, the Duke, back from the palace, headed straight to the house where the family was keeping the head of the family locked up. Pointing a gun at his father, he apologized, saying it had gone on too long, and it was time to end this. Carmen pressed the pistol barrel to Aaron's forehead, who snarled like an animal. Not a trace of his former nobility or wisdom remained on his face. The old man squeezed his eyes shut, and the Duke's hand trembled as he pulled the trigger. Hearing footsteps behind him, Carmen once again couldn't bring himself to kill his own father and lowered the weapon. Turning around, he said with a smile that today was clearly not the day, since they had a guest to meet. Liarte entered the room, and horror was etched on her face at what she saw. Greeting the Duke, the girl confessed that Marilyn wouldn't let her come here, but she needed to report something important, so she had to break the rule. Carmen imagined how difficult it must have been for the maid, since he really didn't allow anyone to come here in his presence. He even kicked out Hans and Andre, and those guys were always glued to Iran's side. The heroine apologized, but she had to tell the Duke something before it was too late. Getting right up in Carmen's face, she declared she could cure his father's condition. Even though the Duke couldn't believe it was possible, Liarte asked him to trust her. Getting his okay, the girl went to Aaron, who was now rattling his chains like a maniac. Carmen told her to be careful, because the old man was super dangerous. But the heroine said there was nothing to worry about and summoned the power of water. In her past life, the Elheims found out about neutralizing the poison way too late. But now Liarte knew that thanks to the powerful force of a water awakened, you could fix the madness. After a couple of minutes, Aaron, who had been fighting like crazy just before, suddenly closed his eyes and his body went limp. Liarte told the Duke that he should be feeling better by the end of the day. Carmen, totally shocked, asked her to explain what happened. She explained that the old man was showing signs of black pollen poisoning. It usually kills regular people, but awakened ones go completely nuts and turn into beasts. Liarte said she learned about it from some ancient texts, which also said water-based awakened can neutralize the poison. She promised to do everything she could to fully heal the head of the Birch family. Confident she could pull it off, she asked the Duke not to off his own father. On top of that, Liarte advised Carmen to keep everything hush-hush from the servants. The Duke was surprised by how perceptive she was. She'd picked up on something he'd noticed too. Birch suspected Hans, Andre, or Marilyn were behind poisoning his father. Since figuring out who was to blame was impossible for now, they agreed to keep everything hush-hush so things wouldn't get even messier. And since Liarte knew way more about this kind of poison, the Duke decided to put all his trust in her on this. But he couldn't be there with her all the time while she was treating him. So for her safety, he offered to assign her a guard she could trust. The heroine was a little flustered by the Duke's offer, but she didn't argue. The next day, at the agreed-upon time, Liarte came to treat Iran again. Mikhail was there to meet her, sent by his father as her personal guard. He promised to protect her, and she was happy with the Duke's decision. When they got to Aaron, Liarte asked Mikhail to step back a little. He got a little worried, but she smiled and assured him she'd be fine. Just before the visit, the heroine had a crazy idea pop into her head, and she decided to go for it, even though she wasn't sure it would work. Liarte stepped up to the old guy, whipped a lollipop out of her pocket, and waved it right in his face. Aaron's eyes went wide, and he froze for a second. But then he snapped his head forward and snatched that candy right out of her hand with his mouth. While the old man was distracted chowing down, Liarte got to work on the healing. Michael was stunned she'd even thought of that. The heroine smiled and reminded him that he'd told her himself how Grandpa loved sweets. The crazy couldn't completely erase who he was, and she figured his taste for stuff like that had to still be there. Now, while the old dude was munching on the candy, Liarte could heal him in peace. The heroine focused and started the procedure. But then Michael called out to her. He wanted to know why Liarte was doing this, since she was already their savior, and they'd protect her no matter what. The heroine smiled and said she just wanted to help them out, since Aaron Birch was a really important guy to the family. Liarte told Michael that the treatment was done for the day, but it would take her at least a week to completely flush out the poison. Until then, they had to figure out exactly who was behind poisoning Mr. Birch. The next day, strolling through the garden, the heroine was racking her brain about how Aaron could have been poisoned. She figured maybe they could find some clues in his room. Since Liarte was thinking out loud, Michael, who suddenly appeared, asked her where she was trying to get into. Young Birche was up in the Rose Tower when he spotted her, and he came down to her right away. The heroine asked him for permission to go into his grandfather's room to look for evidence of the poisoning. Michael gently stroked Liarte's face and told her there wasn't a place in the house she couldn't go. A few minutes later, the two of them were standing in front of Aaron Birch's room. Mikhail opened the door and told her she could stay there as long as she needed. You could tell the room hadn't been used in ages, but it was still pretty clean. Liarte wondered if anything about her had changed since her grandpa went off the deep end, but Mikhail hadn't noticed anything. On the shelves, she found ancient books that were forbidden to read in Elheim. Among all the books, Liarte found one she'd been dying to read and asked Mikhail if she could borrow it. But she couldn't reach the top shelf, so he offered to help her out. Feeling how close Mikhail was standing behind her, she spun around real quick. He grinned and asked Liarte why she was making that face. Mikhail noticed she was blushing and wanted to know if he was the reason. Suddenly, she stepped even closer to him and, pressing against his chest, gave him a hug. Even Michael was flustered this time, so he asked her what brought this on all of a sudden. Red as a beet, Liarte confessed that she wanted to do it because she really liked him. Looking at his surprised face, she asked if that was weird. Michael smiled and, suggesting they do something else, touched her face and leaned in to kiss her. Just then, Andre walked in, cleared his throat, and apologized for interrupting. Awkwardly smiling, Michael was ready to strangle the servant for that. Liarte asked why Andre, not Marilyn, was in Aaron's room, and Birch explained that all three servants took turns tidying up there. On the nightstand, she suddenly noticed a vase of candies that Michael said his grandfather loved. No matter how hard the Duke tried to stop his father from eating sweets for health reasons, he still ate a few every day. Liarte opened the lid, pulled out a candy, and suddenly a realization hit her. Aaron was always munching on those sweets, and nobody ever suspected they were laced with black pollen. The heroine told Michael she needed to see the ex-Duke. As they approached the door, Liarte confidently announced she'd go the rest of the way alone. She needed to check something out, so she asked Michael to wait for her outside. When Liarte knocked, Andre opened the door. To his question of why she was there, she replied that she needed to ask him something. The heroine asked if it was true that he, Marilyn, and Hans took turns cleaning Aaron Birch's room, and Andre confirmed it. Opening her palm, Liarte asked if he knew about the candies from the master's bedroom. The heroine couldn't believe she hadn't figured it out sooner. All the answers were right there. Before she was reborn, Duke Carmen personally took care of his father, believing it was the only way to help him. Birch declared war on the royal family after finding out they were responsible for Aaron's madness. That's when the rumors started spreading about the elite assassins, Marilyn and Andre. But for some reason, the main character had never heard of the third person, Hans. After descending into the dungeon, Liarte told the servant she came to visit Lord Aaron and ask about his condition. Hans replied there was still no improvement, and mentioned he'd have to scold Andre for sending her here alone. To Liarte's suggestion that he and his comrade were very close, the servant replied that they'd been inseparable ever since the master saved them. The heroine inquired if they had, in that case, checked the former Duke's food for harmful ingredients. According to Hans, Andre was always in charge of the food. When he asked what the problem was, Liarte opened her palm and showed the servant a piece of candy. At the sight of it, Hans flinched, instantly broke out in a sweat, and his eyes froze in terror. Giving the servant a hard stare, she asked what he knew about this candy she found in Aaron's room. Looking away, all spooked, Hans swore he was seeing it for the first time. But Liarte wasn't buying it, and accused him of bringing those candies to Birch to poison Lord Aaron. She knew it for a fact, because not long ago, Andre told her how Hans had brought them to the duchy. He couldn't be wrong, since black candies are pretty rare, and even when the master went crazy, Hans kept feeding them to him. Liarte was sure he was doing it because he was scared Aaron might recover. Besides, they also found a ton of those candies in Hans's room. Realizing he couldn't weasel his way out of this, the servant turned and ran to complete his last task. Just then, Liarte noticed a flask with some kind of red liquid in his hands. She realized Hans was going to use it to mess with Aaron somehow, and she screamed. The next thing you know, the scumbag's flat on his back. Courtesy of Mikkel. He grinned, apologizing for not keeping his promise to be there if things went south. Just then, the heroine heard Duke Carmen's voice behind her. He said there was no way he could just stand by and watch someone he cared about get hurt. After his son told him Liarte was in the house, the Duke got worried, and they came looking for her. The heroine had never felt this kind of warmth and care before, the kind she got from Carmen and Mikhail and Birch. The Duke went over to Hans and grabbed the jerk by the hair, the one who poisoned his father. Mikhail picked up a vial from the floor, the one that slipped out of the servant's hand when he fell. He couldn't figure out what it was, because the liquid couldn't be a normal poison, since the birches are resistant to most toxins. After taking a closer look at the bottle's contents, Mikhail thought it looked like blood. Liarte said that interacting with the black pollen could trigger a pretty wild reaction. The girl suggested dealing with that after she'd healed the ex-duke. Claiming she could heal him today, she summoned the power of water and directed it at Aaron. The Duke and his son couldn't believe their eyes when she used her power to lift the old man into the air. The water needed to penetrate deep into Aaron's system to get to the black pollen. So, Liarte completely saturated his body with her water power. The old man started choking, but the girl told him to just hang in there for a little bit. She had zero doubt that she'd finally cure him of his madness this time. A few moments later, she eased up on the power. The water receded, and Aaron lowered to the ground and opened his eyes. The Duke couldn't believe his dad was standing solid on both legs right in front of him. The old man looked up at his family and suddenly spoke, trying to figure out where the heck he was. Rubbing his eyes, he spotted Liarte and was like, "Who's the dame?" Aaron felt the water power and figured this girl had to be from Elheim. Before the Duke could even introduce Liarte to his dad, the old man yelled for Carmen to send her packing ASAP. Aaron still remembered how his wife died, and there was no way he was letting anyone from Elheim stay in Birch. Mikhail jumped into the convo, saying he wasn't sending Liarte back, no matter what Grandpa said. The old dude shot back that if that was the case, he'd be the one leaving the duchy. Then she spoke up, saying that since she wasn't from Birch, like Mr. Aaron rightly pointed out, she'd be the one to bounce. Carmen and Mikhail both said at the same time, "No way are we letting you go anywhere." But the girl didn't want to wreck a family that had just gotten back together. So, she turned tail and bolted out of the house. Mikhail was about to chase after her, but Aaron grabbed his arm, stopping him from catching her. The kids started complaining about his grandpa's attitude, 'cause Liarte saved all their bacon and cured him of his issues. Hearing that this girl had healed him, Aaron was seriously taken aback. He strained his memory, and bam! He remembered everything, crystal clear. After leaving the house, she was thinking that the head of Birch's animosity was pretty understandable. The Elheims and Bircha have always been at each other's throats, especially back in Aaron's day. And there's nothing you can do about it. Rain started coming down, and Liarte tilted her face up to the drops, thinking she probably didn't belong anywhere. But then Mikhail's voice came from behind her, asking her to stop. She said she didn't want to cause any trouble, but he grabbed her by the wrist. Mikhail pulled her close, held her tight, and begged her not to leave. He reminded her that he'd sworn to protect his savior until his dying breath. Without her, nothing else mattered to Mikhail. Nothing had any meaning. No matter what Grandpa said, Liarte had every right to stay in Birch. Mikhail was about to say something else, but just then, Carmen and Aaron walked up. The heroine apologized and said she'd leave the duchy right away, but the old guy said, "Not so fast." Aaron, looking guilty, lowered his head and admitted that he was the one who should be apologizing. He jumped to conclusions without even knowing who saved him, and now he was begging her to forget everything he said. Aaron suddenly remembered that Liarte had used all her power to save him. On top of that, he thanked the girl not only for healing him, but also for saving his grandson. As repayment for the favor done for his family, he declared that Liarte could continue to stay in Birch. From now on, she could stay in the duchy for the rest of her life, if that's what she wanted. And although she was incredibly happy, she suddenly felt a great weakness in her body. Before Liarte could even think that she must be really tired, she lost consciousness in that very moment. The girl was put to bed. a doctor examined her, and it turned out that, fortunately, her health was not in danger. She lost consciousness due to excessive use of her abilities and psychological stress. Mikkel didn't leave Liarte's bedside and sat next to her, holding her hand. Aleph entered the room to inform the Duke that a letter had arrived from the palace. Looks like they somehow found out that the old man has come too. Now that the royal family knew the attempt had failed, Aaron could guess how they would act. And to top it off, it's been raining nonstop since yesterday, not just in Birch, but it looks like across the whole damn empire. Could be tied to Liarte's powers, you know? Just then, the heroine's eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she saw was Mikhail's worried mug. Since Liarte couldn't remember what happened, he filled her in on how she'd passed out. She needed to get some serious rest now. Seeing as she'd burned herself out, the heroine thanked them all for looking out for her. Mikkel said they were all freaking out when she suddenly went down. Liarte turned her head, trying to figure out who he meant by all. Besides Mikhail and Carmen, Aaron Birch was also standing in the room. Grinning, the Duke announced that, as head of the house, he could totally ship the old guy off if he was being a pain in the butt. Mikkel backed his dad up, saying they should just move Grandpa out and let Liarte stay with them. The heroine asked them not to say things like that. But then Aaron himself jumped into the conversation, saying he could just not visit Liarte so he wouldn't bother her, since she needed to rest. The girl smiled and pointed out that Mr. Birch himself had just recovered, and then asked how he was feeling. The old man was so touched by her words that he even teared up. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Empress Terencia was on her way to talk to her son. The servants froze in terror when she showed up, not daring to even breathe. The prince was seriously surprised by his mother's unexpected visit. Turns out, the Empress came to discuss some important news, because she heard a rumor that Aaron Birch was back from the brink and just strolling around his estate. She was ticked at her son for not finishing the job, and that the old guy survived. Lucas defended himself, saying it wasn't his fault, because his plan was perfect, if it hadn't been for that meddling girl from Elheim. Terencia glared at her son, hoping this wasn't the end of it. The Crown Prince assured her he had another way, and this time they'd definitely crush the Birchie family for good. Telling him not to disappoint her again, the Empress left her son's study. But the Crown Prince was certain he'd nail it this time, and not even Lady Elheim could stop him. He summoned the Earl and asked if there was any news on the assignment he'd given Hans. Fades reported that even though the hit failed, a letter arrived confirming the job was done. Lucas was thrilled by the news, because it meant the Birches were about to run out of time. When Liarte felt better, she and Mikhail went to the garden gazebo, where Carmen and Aaron were having tea. The heroine felt like the former Duke was still awkward about what had happened between them before. To ease the tension, she asked about his health, and the old man admitted he hadn't felt this good in ages. Carmen pointed out that it was all thanks to her, Lily. Since Liarte didn't understand what Lily meant, the Duke explained it was a word from the little kingdom where his mother lived. It means everything beautiful, noble, and dear to the heart. According to Mikkel, if his father likes someone, he gives them the affectionate nickname, Lily. The heroine liked the nickname. It gave her a warm, fluttery feeling for the first time in her life. In that very moment, she thought that this was probably happiness. Liarte really liked the cup her tea was served in, and the Duke confessed he'd brought it especially for her. The girl felt good, knowing they were trying to make her happy with all these little things. She thanked the Duke for both the nickname and the cup, thinking it was almost too much for her. Gently touching her cheek, Mikkel replied that it wasn't too much at all, and it was everything she should have always had. Liarte thanked him and rested her head on his shoulder. Carmen backed up his son, adding that they wanted to give the girl everything she'd been missing. He asked her to say what Liarte wanted to do, so they could help her make it happen. Truth be told, what she really wanted was to hold on to this perfect moment forever. But she wanted to do it her own way, so she asked if she could paint a picture. The Duke thought it could be a great hobby, and promised to have Marilyn get everything ready. Michael was curious what Liarte's first painting would be, but he knew it'd be amazing. Since Marilyn's name came up, she realized she hadn't seen her all day. Michael mysteriously said the maid was busy with something important down in the basement. Then he added that she was persuading Hans to cooperate. During the interrogation, he confessed he was a spy for the Crown Prince, but no matter how Marilyn and Andre grilled him, he still wouldn't say what he was up to, snooping around the estate for 2 days before he got caught. Hearing that Hans had covered the whole estate, the heroine knew she couldn't just ignore it. She tried to remember what happened during that time in her past life, after the funeral of the previous head of the Birch family. Liarte's gaze fell on the candle on the table, and she suddenly remembered. After the declaration of war, a huge fire broke out in the duchy, claiming the lives of half the servants. This incident, which the heroine read about in the newspaper back then, might be connected to Hans somehow. Noticing Liarte was lost in thought, Mikael suggested they investigate this together and take a walk while they're at it, since he was planning on checking out the estate and the places Hans had been. Carmen happily supported his son's idea. Since Aron got excited hearing about the walk, Mikael asked if he wanted to join Liarte too. Looking a little sheepish, the old guy confirmed his grandson's guess. And since Liarte just got out of bed today, Mikael suggested they scout things out tomorrow. The heroine had no doubt that, since she managed to cure Aron's madness, she could help them this time too. She was totally determined to protect everyone she cared about in Birch. Meanwhile, back at the Elheim estate, Einlius went to his father's office to talk something over. A few days ago, when it was raining nonstop across the whole empire, he felt like his water powers just dried up. Turns out, Einlius wasn't the only one who experienced something like that. So now he's come to the Duke to find out if he felt the same thing. After listening carefully to his son, Elheim admitted that it happened to him too. When Einlius asked if it could be connected to Liarte somehow, the Duke said yes. Ever since our girl moved to Birchwood, she's been sleeping like a log. Maybe she finally feels safe here. Something she never had back in Elheim. Marilyn heard the lady was invited out, but she explained it was more of a recon mission. Still, the maid noticed the vibe in the mansion's been way better since Liarte showed up. The master and mistress always respected each other, but they kept their distance, and it was kinda awkward. Now, Marilyn's genuinely happy about the change. She got everything Liarte needs for her painting ready and told her to holler if she needs anything else. The maid wondered if the lady had decided what she was gonna paint yet. Instantly, the image of Michael and his shining eyes popped into her head. But she just said she's keeping it a secret for now and would tell Marilyn later. The maid said she couldn't wait to find out, because she's super curious. When the heroine asked if she and Andre had learned anything while torturing Hans, Marilyn said they'd figured out what liquid he had in that flask. It was human blood with a unique mana structure, probably belonging to the crown prince. And when they tried mixing the black pollen with the blood, there was a pretty big explosion, which led them to believe someone was trying to off Aron Birch that way. Marilyn shuddered to think what might have happened if Liarte hadn't helped. She sincerely thanked her for saving someone so important to them. The heroine replied that she did what she had to, because someone important to Bircha was now important to her too. Marilyn was incredibly touched by the girl's words. Liarte asked her to recall any other information she and Andre managed to get. According to the maid, Hans had been repeating the phrase, "tonight at midnight," all morning for some reason. The heroine froze. This could only mean the mansion was going to go up in flames tonight. Just then, Mikael walked in to get Liarte, and the first thing he says is how amazing she looks. But she was clearly bugging out about something, and he was immediately all over it, trying to figure out what's wrong. Liarte didn't know if Mikael would believe her if she told him the mansion was going to burn down tonight. All she had to back it up was knowledge from her past life, and she knew it sounded totally nuts. Still, she couldn't deal with this on her own. Dropping to one knee in front of Liarte, looking her straight in the eyes, Mikael swore he'd be on her side and believe her no matter what. He wanted her to know that from now on, she wouldn't have to sweat anything alone. Now, Mikael was there and ready to help her with anything, anytime. So, kissing her palm, he asked her to tell him what was eating at her. Closing her eyes, the heroine reminded herself again that this place ain't Elheim. She had to protect the people of Birch, the ones who trusted her. So, Liarte, after warning him it might sound crazy, declared that the mansion would go up in flames tonight. She explained that Hans, who'd been snooping around Birch for days, might be the one behind it. Liarte was almost positive the fire would happen tonight, so she wanted to check things out herself. Mikael figured they had to move fast, because if all this was true, they could be in deep trouble. He suggested telling his dad and grandpa everything, so they could scout the situation together. The heroine was pleasantly surprised that Mikael actually believed her. Gently stroking her face, he reminded her that he'd promised her he would. In that moment, Liarte understood what it meant to have someone truly believe in you. No questions asked. Once they told Carmen and Aron everything that happened with Mikael, they immediately joined up to scout things out. The Duke asked Lily if she had any theories on how Hans was planning to start the fire. The heroine figured he might be using some kind of ancient magic for it. The Crown Prince had already tried to take Birch out a few times using that exact method, so it made sense to assume he'd try it again. The only question was how they were going to pull it off this time. Judging by the chains Mikkel saw in his eyes, that magic had to have a trigger, someone hidden somewhere. Stopping near the lake, Aaron pointed out that Hans had been hanging around here the longest. According to the intel, he could have hidden something in this area. The heroine decided to take a quick look around and headed straight for the water. The second she stepped onto the water, every guy in Birch yelled that it could be dangerous. But then they froze, stunned, seeing Liarte standing on top of the water like it was solid ground. And even though Aaron figured walking on water was an Elheim thing, Carmen was betting only Lily could do that. The heroine waved to everyone on the shore to show she was okay and headed out to check the deeper parts of the lake. Figuring something might be hidden in the water itself, she started looking closely. But then, out of nowhere, Liarte's foot started sinking. She thought it was super weird that she couldn't control the water in this spot. Taking a closer look, the heroine spotted a stone among the others on the bottom, with ancient symbols carved into it. Pulling it out of the water, Liarte told the others she'd found what they were looking for. Clearly, this stone was the magical key Hans had set up. Carmena was furious at how far the royal family had gone, not stopping at just cursing Mikael and poisoning Aron. The heroine figured these magical items were stashed all over the mansion. The sun was already going down, and there wasn't much time left to find them all, since Hans mentioned midnight. That's why Liart asked the Duke to get everyone out of the castle ASAP. Mikkel suggested getting the knights involved in the search for the conduits, but she took it on herself, thinking it would be faster, since some of them might be plants. Grabbing Mikkel's hand, Liart asked him to show her all the places Hans had been. Putting his arm around her, he declared that in that case, it would only be right if he carried her. The estate had a lot of narrow paths a carriage couldn't get through, so Mikkel figured carrying Liarte would get them around faster. Without a second thought, the heroine agreed and wrapped her arms around his neck. Aaron told her to be careful and not screw herself up while disarming those magic stones. Liarte asked us not to worry about her, saying she really wanted to repay Birch for trusting her completely. After a while, she and Mikael managed to disable their 8th conduit. The way she figured it, they still had about 3 more to go. Mikkel scooped her up in his arms, 'cause they were running out of daylight. And just then, Liart noticed a fire had broken out in the mansion. She realized with a jolt that they'd missed that spot during the search. Mikkel tried to calm her down, saying her father probably got everyone out already. He was sure nobody was hurt, and they could put out the little fire quick. But at that exact moment, a huge explosion went off, and the fire blazed up even bigger. This was super bad news, because that's where the Birch family's power of death was located. Even though unleashing this power couldn't affect the direct descendants of Birch, it was capable of wiping out regular people. That's why no one has ever even gotten close to this place. Looks like the fire was set specifically to unleash that power and destroy everyone in the Birchy estate. If something goes sideways, that power could spread throughout the entire empire. And since the royal family wouldn't go this far just to kill ordinary people and soldiers, it could mean Liarte was their target. Remembering that before her rebirth the fire was only in the estate, the heroine realized with horror that the future had changed because of her. Valto ran up to Mikael and Liarte, shouting that the power of death was spreading, and the lady needed to get to safety immediately. The heroine was shocked that the knight wanted her to run away alone, but Valto explained that the dukes would be fine, but she wouldn't be able to withstand that power. The Birches had the ability to teleport people long distances, and their powers would be enough to save Liarte. But the girl was confused, not understanding what would happen to Valto, Marilyn, and the other servants if that were the case. She couldn't just save herself when everyone else's lives were in danger. Valto told her not to worry, and tried to assure her that everyone else would be evacuated too. But she knew that was a lie, because the forest around the estate would go up in flames faster than the people of Birch could escape. Liarte firmly stated that she wouldn't run away alone no matter what, and she would put out the fire. Valto tried to stop her, saying that all the water in all of Birch wouldn't be enough to stop a blaze like that. Despite Mikkel's concerns that Liarte might get hurt, she declared that she couldn't let people die. She promised to protect Birch, and so she fearlessly stood before the fire, ready to use the power of water against it. The reason the conduits were hidden in the water was to use it as an ancient magical offering. In other words, putting out the fire with water from the Birch estate was a lost cause. So, Liarte had to summon a major downpour all on her own. Mikhail just stood there, motionless in the pouring rain, watching her. From the moment they met, he'd promised to protect her, and he still thought that's exactly what he was doing. But it hit him. Since day one, the one being rescued wasn't Liart. It was him. Aeneas entered Liarte's room to talk to Leonrisius. Ever since his sister left Elheim, he'd spent every day in her bedroom. Aeneas still couldn't believe they'd let the true heir slip through their fingers and were stuck with a fake. The family needed Liarte, so he suggested his brother send another letter to Bircha, hoping for a response this time. Aeneas barely finished speaking when a massive rainstorm suddenly broke outside. That same feeling of fading power washed over him again, just like during the last downpour. While Aeneas was freaking out about the possibility of losing his power, Leonricius just kept sitting there on the bed, totally still. All he said was that Elheim would probably be completely drained of power pretty soon. Compared to her past life, a lot has changed in the heroine's destiny this time around. Now the people in Birch are safe, and she was happy she could protect the place. The weird thing was, after summoning such a huge rain, Liarte didn't feel weak at all. Actually, it was the opposite. Like her water power had gotten even stronger. Like she'd gotten back something she'd lost a long time ago. Liarte realized that she'd probably absorbed the abilities of all the Elheims. A strange rustling sound pulled the girl from her thoughts, and turning around, she saw a silver fox cub near her feet. Crouching down, Liarte stroked its cute little face, and the little animal purred contentedly. The heroine figured the fox cub was probably lost, but Mikhail, who suddenly appeared beside her, said it had always been there. Liarte was stoked to see him, and said she just needed some fresh air. She asked if the fox kit was raised at the Birch estate, but Mikhail said he brought it from Elheim after a hunting competition. He didn't want to show her the critter, thinking it might bring up some bad memories. Mikhail hadn't started training the fox yet, and turns out it's pretty feisty. But the way it was just chilling in her arms showed that it liked her. She gave the fluffy little guy a gentle hug, and she was totally smitten. Mikhail was happy about that, but he was worried her dad and grandpa would get mad if they found out she was out for a walk instead of resting. She smiled and said she was fine. They just worry about her too much. Mikhail stroked Liarte's face and admitted that he was the one who worried about her the most. He really didn't want her putting herself in harm's way again. He knew, though, if it happened again, she'd make the same damn choice. Still, Michael wished that next time, they could tackle the problem together. He told her to remember he'd always protect her, no matter how rough or dangerous it got, because she meant everything to him. Michael's words warmed her heart like crazy, and she thanked him for that. Just then, Aleph walked up and said the Duke wanted to see them. When they got to his office, Carmen's first question was how Lily was feeling. She thanked the Duke for his concern, and Michael cut to the chase, asking why he'd called them in. Carmen smirked and announced it looked like it was time to settle some scores. Birch had plenty of spies in the royal palace, so it wouldn't be a problem to pull this off. Carmen wanted Lily's take on it all, and that's why he'd called them in. Even though Mikhail thought it was pretty harsh to leave the decision up to Liarte, the Duke figured that as a member of the Birch family, she needed to get used to this kind of thing. The heroine knew the Duke wouldn't just let things slide after the royal palace's disgusting behavior. She said she respected his decision, but asked him not to hurt any innocent people in the process. Carmen agreed to her request, and then she decided to tell them something else. Liarte confessed that on that day when it rained so hard, she felt an unbelievable surge of power. The Birches were shocked to hear that she might have taken all the Elheim family's power that day. After processing what she said, they were stoked, anticipating the royal family's reaction to the news that the Elheims had lost their power. Liarte wondered what would happen if the ruling family found out about it. Carmen replied that they wouldn't just sit back, because without the Awakened, their power would be in serious trouble. The royal family had relied on the Elheims for a long time, and they happily took advantage of it. So if they lose their power, they'll finally get what's coming to them. Birch's attacks on Birch were always about holding back their growing power. But without the Elheims, it'll be tough. Carmen could imagine what would happen then, sure, but Birch wouldn't be around to see it. All they could do was watch from the sidelines as their enemies slowly fell apart. Meanwhile, the prince, lying in bed, gleefully pictured the Birch estate buried in a mountain of ash. Lucas was riding high, finally fulfilling his family's ambition. something they'd been chasing for generations. Suddenly, Count Fettes rushed into the room, looking like he'd seen a ghost. The prince felt a little rough from using ancient magic, but he was sure turning Birch to ash was worth it. And then Fettes told him that Birch had managed to put out the fire pretty damn fast. Lucas couldn't believe what he was hearing. There's no way a fire like that could just be put out. The Count knew the magic fire was seriously powerful, but the problem was, it started pouring rain. The prince gripped the sheets, a dark look on his face, realizing that girl from Elheim was behind this again. He was furious that Liarte had once again screwed up his plans he'd put so much effort into. Right then and there, Lucas made up his mind to get that girl, even if it meant giving her the title of princess. Getting out of bed, he ordered Fettes to find out everything about the Duke of Elheim's daughter. What she likes, what she hates. The crown prince barely finished his sentence when a massive explosion went off, and he and the Count were blasted with a flash of light. Turning to the window, Lucas saw that everything around them was engulfed in flames. A maid rushed into the room and told the crown prince he needed to see His Majesty immediately. The king had already received word that a fire, unlike any they'd seen before, had broken out in Lucas's palace. They couldn't put it out with the palace water, and there was a high risk the fire would spread across the entire palace grounds. Lucas tried to say something, to explain, but his father cut him off. The king wanted to know if he'd done anything to set Birch off like that. After all, His Majesty had warned his son countless times not to upset that family. Lucas gritted his teeth, furious, not understanding how things had gone so wrong. Birch was supposed to be the one in the hot seat right now. If they were out of the picture, the biggest threat to the royal family would be gone. But for some reason, father always forbade touching Birch. The king announced he'd sent a request for help to the Elheim Duchy, and they should be arriving soon. So, he ordered Lucas to be polite to them, making it clear he wasn't going to forgive any more screw-ups. The prince figured if the Elheims put out the fire, they could smooth things over, and maybe he could finally bring Liarte to the palace. Just then, a knight announced the arrival of the ducal family. Hearing this, the king ordered them to ask the Elheims to put out the fire as quickly as possible. But the knight suddenly reported a problem. The Elheims weren't planning on doing anything. On his way to the palace, the duke was thinking about how their family had lost its water power. The lower-class awakened Elheims had reverted back to being ordinary people. The direct heirs had a little power left, but it still wasn't nearly enough. And if they used their power even once, they'd become unawakened themselves, the very thing they despised. The duke was completely lost and didn't know what they should do when the king ordered them to put out the fire. The carriage arrived at the palace, and Einlius reminded his lost-in-thought father that it was time to get out. But the duke suddenly declared that there was no way they were leaving the carriage. He announced that the Elheims had arrived at the palace, but they refused to interfere in the matters between the royal family and the Birches. Viamina panicked at the thought of disobeying the royal family, but her father stated that they could lose their power completely while putting out the fire, so they shouldn't get involved in this mess. When the duke asked where Tandrian was, Einlius replied that no one had seen him since the fire started. The elder Elheim was furious, not understanding what that useless idiot could be doing at a time like this. Suddenly, representatives of His Majesty's Knight Order knocked on the carriage door. The duke opened the door and found that the king himself had come to speak with them. His Majesty had heard that the Elheims were refusing to put out the fire, and he understood their position of not wanting to interfere in the conflict with Birche. However, he suspected that they not only didn't want to, but also couldn't do it. Therefore, the king ordered the Elheims to immediately demonstrate their power to him. The duke broke out in a sweat, and he didn't even have the strength to object to anything. His Majesty, who had immediately suspected something was up after their initial refusal, repeated his order again, obediently exiting the carriage. The Elheims asked how exactly they could demonstrate their powers. There was a small greenhouse burning nearby, not connected to the crown prince's palace, and the king ordered it to be put out. The duke assigned the task to Viamin, who was shaking with fear. Not daring to refuse, the youngest son summoned his power, but he only managed to form a small energy ball. Viamin couldn't hold it, and, his whole body trembling, he lowered his hands in defeat. Lian Ricius looked at his brother, who had just, right before their eyes, completely lost his power and become unawakened. To the duke's question of whether this was enough as proof, the king dryly replied that he had seen enough. However, he reminded them that the others still hadn't demonstrated their abilities. Now it was the Duke's turn, and hearing this, he froze in terror. The king allowed him to skip putting out the fire and promised to clear Elheim of suspicion if he showed his magic. The Duke was terrified to imagine what would happen if his family lost their abilities, since their power in the kingdom rested solely on their water magic. The king gave the order to begin, and a magic orb ignited in Elheim's hands as well. Right then, a strange sound came from above, and everyone tilted their heads to the sky. It suddenly turned purple, and a magic circle with ancient writing was clearly visible among the clouds. A few minutes earlier, when the fire broke out, chaos reigned in the prince's palace. And while everyone ran around, fruitlessly trying to put out the fire, only one cloaked figure remained calm. Unnoticed by everyone, he descended into the dungeon, remembering the way as he went. Passing by the now familiar gargoyles, he realized he had found the place where the prince was hiding a creature resembling the Spirit Queen. Finally, Tandarian found what he was looking for, seeing her under the dome of the chamber. Elheim felt like something was different this time, and then he noticed the Spirit Queen's eyes were open. After confirming the creature was awake, Tandarian asked what exactly she was. The creature grinned and announced that she was the past. So Tandarian figured that meant she could turn back time, right? He knew tailing the crown prince hadn't been a waste of time when the queen confirmed it, adding it would take a lot out of her. The creature caught a whiff of water from the unexpected guest and realized he was a water awakened. On top of that, the Spirit Queen picked up on a scent of something fake coming from Tandarian, and he knew she was talking about Leonricius. And even though she was giving off some seriously creepy vibes, he wasn't about to say anything about his brother until she explained why she needed him. The creature declared that she needed to find her other half to become a complete Spirit King, and then she could rewind time as much as she damn well pleased. Tandarian smirked, because this was the perfect chance to get Liarti back to when she belonged to the Elheim. He promised to bring the fake, but in exchange, he wanted proof that she really was a spirit connected to the past. Elheim said he'd believe her if she turned back time to when the palace caught fire. And even though it had knocked the spirit out for months, it was a small price to pay to expose the fake. So, after thinking for a bit, she agreed and took the deal. Declaring he'd wait for the fake, the spirit waved his hand and drifted back to sleep. Before anyone could figure out what that wheel in the sky was, it vanished. At that exact moment, the king was told that the whole palace fire had suddenly disappeared. His Majesty was happy about the news, even though he was bummed he didn't get to see the Elheim power. Expressing hope he'd see it later, the king turned his horse towards the palace. Riding off, he added that the Duke wouldn't get away with it next time. Elheim had no doubt anymore that His Majesty knew about their family's situation. On the way home, Einlius announced that their whole family was about to fall apart. He also figured out that the king just wanted to test if they had any magical abilities and was dreading the next time. The Duke stated flatly that they needed to get Liarte back to Elheim immediately. But when his eldest son replied that they hadn't received a response to any of the letters sent to Birch, he lost it and yelled that if they weren't getting an answer, they'd have to persuade them more forcefully. Einlius couldn't believe his father could be like this, since they'd always been a close family. But now there was nothing but animosity between them. Just then, Tandarian approached Einlius, looking unusually cheerful, unlike the rest of them. It even pissed his brother off that he could be smiling in a situation like this. He told Tandarian not to waste time messing around, because they needed to get Liarte back ASAP. But then he confidently declared that he would definitely make it happen. Tandarian turned to Leonricius, since all he needed was his okay. He told his brothers he'd found a surefire way to bring Liarte back to Elheim. That crazy grin spread across Leonricius's face again, and he promised he'd do anything to get his sister back. Meanwhile, the heroine was painting a picture, with Marilyn standing behind her, and the little fox dozing peacefully in a chair. When the maid remarked that the little critter was really attached to her, she replied that he was indeed sweet and very obedient. Apparently, Liarte was the only one who thought so, because Marilyn immediately remembered all the mischief the little fox got up to when other people were around. The maid was amazed by the beautiful painting, in which her mistress had depicted the sea. The heroine told her that it was the first sea she had ever seen in her life. When she lived in Elheim, she always dreamed of seeing something vast and open. When Mikael took her from there, he took her to the sea, which was firmly imprinted in her memory. Marilyn, totally digging the painting again, suggested framing it. But the girl had other ideas. She was planning on gifting the painting to someone special. Mikael was chatting with Valto in the garden when Liarte called out to him. She approached him hesitantly, clutching a canvas to her chest. Looking down shyly, she held out the painting to Mikhail. She said it was her first ever painting, and she decided to paint the sea they'd admired together. Mikhail was over the moon to receive such a treasure, saying it was the best gift he'd ever gotten. Valto took a look at the painting too, and he and his master agreed the girl definitely had talent. They both figured that kind of talent shouldn't go to waste, and Liarte should enter the competition. There was a painting contest going on in the kingdom where nobles could enter anonymously. It was a free-for-all to show off your skills, and Mikhail was betting Liarte's piece would take the crown. The heroine had heard about this contest before her rebirth. The kingdom had 3 dukes and 1 archduke. Elus, who was tight with Empress Terentia. Duke Elheim was water-awakened, Birch was death-awakened, and Duke Haran was shrouded in mystery. The heroine heard he hid his face behind a mask and was the contest's big-shot judge, going by the name Jen Walker. By entering the competition, Liarte would get a chance to meet him, which could be a real boon for the Birch family. So, she told Mikhail she'd enter, and he promised to put in a good word with his dad. He thanked Liarte again for the gift, saying he never expected to get anything from her first. The heroine didn't catch his drift, but Mikhail dodged the question and asked what she wanted in return. Since she hadn't even thought about it, he decided to pick something out himself, but he was keeping it under wraps for now. Liarte didn't get what he was saying, but she promised to trust him and wait it out. All of a sudden, a booming sound echoed from the sky, and everyone looked up. Valto didn't know what was going on, but the heroine thought she saw the sky turn black for a split second. Mikhail felt it too, like some intense energy had suddenly gathered up above. For some reason, Liarte was hit with a really bad feeling. Mikhail pulled her close and told her not to worry, that nothing had happened. Still, he kept staring at the sky, thinking about how Birch's spies were supposed to be torching the Crown Prince's palace right now, and this could be connected somehow. Despite the heroine's bad vibes, the next few days were peaceful and quiet. After deciding to enter the competition, she kept practicing her painting. She gradually got used to spending time with the Birch family, who were always asking what she wanted. She smiled so much these past few days. Back in Elheim, she couldn't even dream of something like this. But now, the rage she used to feel when she thought about Elheim? It's just gone. Honestly, she doesn't even care what's been happening to them all this time. Liarte was back at her easel when Marilyn came in and asked if she'd like to take a stroll in the garden. The weather was perfect, so she agreed right away. Marilyn smiled and remarked that on a special day for someone, even the sky seems to be smiling. Before Liarte could figure out what the maid meant, she stopped and gestured for her mistress to go ahead. The heroine looked up and froze, completely stunned. Near the gazebo stood the servants and all the members of the Birch family, holding huge bouquets of flowers. Mikhail smiled, stepped towards Liarte, and wished her a happy birthday. The heroine had completely forgotten that it was actually her birthday. On top of that, though, it was also the anniversary of her mother's death, and the day they celebrated the birth of her twin brother, Leon Ritius. Every year on this day, she'd sit alone in a dark room, staring out the window. Liarte wasn't sad. She just always thought of it as a normal thing. But now, the girl was standing in the birch garden, surrounded by blue roses. Since Liarte's name means blue roses, they bought up every single one in the kingdom, hoping she'd like it. And the heroine really did appreciate the warmth in everyone's eyes as they looked at her. They threw her a birthday party, something no one had ever done before. Taking Liarte's hand, Michael confessed that meeting her was the luckiest thing that ever happened to him. He kissed the back of her hand and thanked her for being born. The heroine was touched, because for the first time in her life, her birth wasn't called a mistake. Her heart overflowed with warmth and joy at how Birch was thanking her for becoming a member of their family. Carmen and Aaron had long considered her their own, because without Liarte, they wouldn't even be around anymore. Leaning over the girl, Mikhail smiled and admitted he was really glad to be spending this day with her, and suggested they celebrate it here together every year. Hearing those words, Liarte couldn't hold back her emotions anymore, and tears streamed from her eyes. Berta rushed to comfort her, not understanding why Lily was crying. Wiping away tears and smiling, the girl replied that she was okay, and she was just really happy. The heroine was sure she would never forget this day, and even if something really bad happened, she could keep living just because of these memories. But the celebration didn't end with just congratulations, and it was time for presents. Aaron gave Liarte a ring with the family crest, so she could buy whatever she wanted just by dropping the ex-duke's name. Carmen gifted her the deed to some land, making her the outright owner. Marilyn personally crafted a necklace for her ladyship. Valto and Andre also chipped in with some smaller gifts in their own names. After the killer party, Mikhail walked Liarty back to her room. But just as she was about to say goodnight, he gave her this sly grin and said it wasn't over yet, because the most important thing was still coming. When Mikhail opened the door, the heroine saw 17 gifts he'd set up for her in the bedroom. Even though Liarty was already blown away by the sheer number of them, he pointed out that one was missing. Mikhail suggested she open one of the gifts, and she picked up a red box. When Liart pulled out a teddy bear, he said it was a gift for her 4th birthday. Mikhail got her gifts for every single one of her birthdays. Yeah, he was late, obviously, but he really wanted to celebrate each one with her. Liarty jumped up and ran to Mikhail, giving him a huge hug. Thinking about everything he did for her, tears started streaming down her face. She felt like he'd even saved the old her. It hit her. Mikhail was the most important gift in her life. After that, Mikhail told Liarty that his dad suggested they throw her coming-of-age ceremony in Birch after the painting competition. The Dukes didn't care that it already happened. They just wanted everyone to know she was part of the family now. Liarty loved the idea, and she happily agreed. Mikhail said there'd be a ton of people at the event, including the Elheims, and he wanted to know how she felt about that. Liarty just shrugged it off, said she didn't care. Those people meant nothing to her anymore. Aenlius got a letter from Birch and hauled ass straight to his dad's office. But the Duke was totally blindsided to hear Liarty's coming-of-age ceremony was happening in Birch in a few months. They still didn't know if the Spirit Queen Tandrian talked to was awake, so they couldn't just bring the girl back yet. There was a real chance the Elheims would get totally humiliated in front of the other nobles, so the Duke was wondering if they should even bother going. But Leonritius, who overheard the whole thing, said there was nothing to think about. They absolutely had to go. He smirked like he knew something we didn't, saying Liarty was family and they had to be at the ceremony.